I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Meeting Budget Override Evaluation Committee, January 13th, 2020. We have a lot to get through tonight. This meeting is being televised on local access TV. Like I said, we have a lot to get through, and right now I'll open up to public forum. If anyone in the gallery has anything to say that is not on the agenda. All right, seeing one. Vote on minutes. Has everyone received a copy of the minutes? Okay. I'll entertain a motion.
Second.
All in favor?
Actually, I just wanted to make a comment on the minutes dated October 17th. The vote was X0. Did you want to put 7-0 or?
I had to recheck the recording because I couldn't tell.
Okay.
So what I did for the other one, I think I just put it voted unanimously.
Gotcha.
Or voted in the majority. I know that Dawn abstained, that's why I didn't have the numbers.
I see.
So what I'll do, voted with Ms. Byers abstaining.
And then my only other comment, in November 18th, I actually don't know what it says in the recording, but the town education budget is approximately 44% of the town budget according to the Mars report. I can check with Dawn. I believe the number is 46 for Whitman. 44 was the Hanson number.
That's right.
Okay.
46.
So some of those percentages are a little jumbled in the
Where was that?
November 18th meeting minutes, the third paragraph.
If you follow that down, she noted that our target contribution.
Target contribution should be 46. I think that's actually 47. And then the actual is 46.
Okay.
I'll double check the Mars report and email that to you, but,
Well, actually, I'll just have to go back and
or check the recording.
check the recording because if it's not that, I'll strike it because I don't want to put in an accurate number in
Yeah.
there.
Okay, so we will adopt with changes to be made, if that's acceptable to everyone. Okay. Okay. Chairman's report. A lot of information has been circulated recently. Like I said, we do have a lot to go over this evening. As part of my report, I have created somewhat of an outline that covers just about everything on the agenda that should help us kind of keep track and get through this meeting. What I've realized is we really need to, this committee is going to have a difficult job to run concurrently with other committees. We need to come up with some recommendations on things that we have discussed for presentations to the Board of Selectmen tomorrow night. And then what I'm going to do is also post for the joint meeting between the FinCom and the Board of Selectmen on the 21st. I think this committee should also be posted as to attend that joint meeting as well, although a majority of us will already be there. So that being said, after Mr. Galvin's presentation, we will get into the guideline, which is in your packet, which covers just about everything else on the agenda, and that should be pretty self-explanatory as we start following that. So I will open the floor now to Mr. Galvin, who has a presentation regarding revenue, and after that, we'll continue along.
Okay, thank you. One of the things when I was appointed to this committee as a budget override, Proposition 2.5, levies, levy limits, all of these things, somebody challenged me to said, I hope that you really understand what how important this committee is. So I thought about it and I said, I really don't understand what Proposition 2.5 is. I really don't understand how levies are calculated. And I thought it was important to go back and look at it and research it. There are two important documents that get filed, that just recently get filed to the DOR, and that's the levy limit, which basically certifies our new growth and basically tells us how much we can raise our property taxes. The second, and more detailed, is a tax recap form. And basically what I've done is taking these two forms and kind of done a 10-year or 5-year look back to kind of see what has happened and where we're going and try to develop some trends. And in doing that, I found a lot of holes in what we do and how we do it, at least in my opinion. And I just kind of wanted to bring that up to you. So this first sheet is the tax levy. And there are some important terms to understand. Obviously, the levy limit and what that is, what new growth is, what the maximum allowable levy is. So if you look at the top line is where we start every year. So if you look at 2020, which is, these are our actuals, you start out with 25 million and change, which was, if you look down, was the levy limit from 2019. So basically, if you look at this form, each year we start out with the levy limit of what we had the previous year. From that, we add 2.5%, because that's the law. They say we can only add 2.5%. And then included in that is what's called new growth. And new growth is the new builds, or new buildings, or additions to buildings, or anything that is improving, is changing your property. That's the only number in this calculation that's an estimate. Everything else is hard line. So right now, we know that we have $25 million to start for revenue next year from the levy, plus 2.5%, another 630. What we need to do now is estimate what our new growth can be, and that can be tricky. There's no question that whenever you estimate something, it can be tricky. Last year, we actually estimated 350,000, and we thought that was probably, based on all the building that's going on, that would probably look pretty good. It actually came in $100,000 less, more than $100,000 less. But anyway, let's move forward. So we come up with a levy limit, an estimate, well, for 2020 of 26,106,000, and that's the most that we can do a levy on under law, Proposition 2.5, unless we do an override. So this is where I'm trying to tie this in. Now, we did something last year that we all know called the debt exclusion. And the debt exclusion is what we asked the voters to exclude from this levy limit. So we actually have two debt exclusions on the books right now. We have the high school that runs out in 2027, and we have the new debt exclusion that just got added for the police station and that. So that totals $1.1 million. So by law, we are now able to ignore Proposition 2.5 and add that to our levy limit. So basically, we're not ignoring it, but we add it on as an exclusion. So now we're able to levy 27 million. Great, there's where we are. We know what that is. And we can go next year, and Madden said this, we could go 10 years out and get pretty close to what we're going to be able to levy in property taxes. This is where it gets confusing, because what our actual levy is not an addition formula, it's a subtraction formula. So if you look down and at the bottom, we actually start off with, to calculate the levy, we start out with how much we appropriate. Well, how do we know how much we're gonna, what's that number? That number is what we vote on Article 2, plus all the capital expenses that we vote on to also fund, plus the excluded numbers, that the $1.1 million, plus other debt service or whatever numbers that we have in there. So last year, that was actually $42,756,000. That was from town meeting, what we voted at town meeting. Then the state takes away money. State takes away money for cherry sheet offsets, takes away money for state cherry sheet charges, which is like Plymouth County things, mosquito control, a lot of money. Then we also, whatever we overspend from the snow and ice deficit also has to get, because we have to make up the difference. We put in 120,000. Last year, we spent 180,000. So we have to make up the difference because we overspent it. Those are things that happen every year. So we have to add that on, 42 million. Then this is the area that really needs to be more obvious to us and included in our budgeting process. Here is $15 million that we have as a revenue source that gets added on to the tax levy. Where does that $15 million come from, and how is it calculated, and how is it all figured out, is what this second sheet's all about, okay? But before we get there, what we're actually doing now to come up with the actual levy is taking that $42 million that we need to raise and subtracting the other revenues, $15 million that we have from other sources. And that tells us how much we can actually levy. In this case, it was $27,223,000, only $21,000 under what our levy limit is. So we actually did really good last year in budgeting to what we had for revenues. But those of you that were all involved in that process, and I was kind of on the outside looking in, know how much of a crazy time that was last year. And that we did this good was, to me, the effort of everybody involved, but we kind of got lucky, I think, in my opinion. We got lucky.
Do you mind?
Go ahead.
For the sake of simplicity, can you just, when you say this is how much we can actually levy, so
So-
for those who are listening, that means how much we can levy means assess for property taxes, right?
No.
Is that- Okay,
See,
so I'm sorry to get ahead of you.
the actual levy is, even though the state says we can do 27,244,000 in our maximum allowable, we have to appropriate that properly to come up with that number. Because if we don't appropriate our Article 2 properly, if we don't appropriate our capital expenditures properly, and we don't appropriate enough, then we end up, because it's a subtraction formula, then we end up with greater excess levies as we have seen in previous years. So what my point is here is we need to develop a target. We need to forecast what the revenue is going to be for 2021 and beyond, but let's start at 2021. So we can have a better job of understanding how much money we have to spend, so that the Finance Committee and the Capital Expenditures Committee can have an easier time in trying to figure out how much they can appropriate. Because if we don't appropriate the amount and we go under, then that ends up in excess levy capacity, and we don't appropriate what we can. And if you look back, there are several, especially the last 2019, the last 5 years, we really haven't done a good job in appropriating the amount of money that we could under Proposition 2.5, because we left 360,000, 330,000, 713,000, 1,400,000, money that we could have appropriated and didn't because we didn't have the revenue forecasting in place that we should have to better understand how much money we have to spend. I've created this document for the second document for the FinCom, and what that does is take tax recap sheet and go back 5 years and basically look at what this town has spent, giving us some averages and giving us some percentages of increases on critical items. The most critical item, well, I shouldn't say the most, but a very critical item is the bottom. The bottom is our local receipts. It's $4 million in revenue that we add on to what we can do in property tax. We've been very aggressive in our local receipts in budgeting basically almost 100% of what we have done the year before. And what Mr. Madden recommends is that we should be at 85%. Now, I tend to think that's a little bit conservative for us, but in doing that, it gives us some buffer room if we're going to start forecasting revenue and getting an idea of where we need to go. I think it's important to note that if we are able to work together, that we can really do a better job in spending the money we have more and appropriating it, making better decisions on how we appropriate it. I think obviously we're going to be talking later about our Article 2 and how we're going to budget that, but we're also trying to free up a lot of money for capital expenditures. And having an understanding of where we're at and having the FinCom and the Capital Committee and the administration agree on certain parameters, it'll help us all, in my opinion. I know there's a lot of numbers in here, and it's really not the numbers that I'm here to talk about, it's the process. In order for us in May's town meeting to make a educated and well thought out budget, we need to start at the other side. Last year we built it up and we saw what was left at the second meeting after we had a debt exclusion, and we were able to take what's left and give it to capital. This year we need to see what we have, in my opinion. We need to see what we have. This is how much money we have to spend. How much of it do we want to go to capital, and how much of it do we want to go to Article 2? And if we can do that, we're going to have a better plan in place to work on have a better budget and also have a better capital plan. Sorry, there's probably no questions because probably everybody doesn't have a clue what I just said.
Well, just to get, I saw Dawn was a little bit confused about that levy discussion. There are two pieces of revenue. The tax revenue is defined by statute. We determine, it's not an estimate. When we set the tax rate, it's no longer an estimate. It's an actual number. What's still an estimate is the local receipts.
Right.
So for example, if you had, what we have typically done is we've estimated marginally less than what we collected the previous year. But you have to remember, when we set our tax rate, we still don't know what that number is because it doesn't get finalized. So it's a little bit of art and a little bit of science, but we've done pretty well in the local receipts area. So much so that we're probably getting too dependent on it. And that's where I think we need to, I agree with John Madden that we're estimating too high because we're not leaving room for a mistake or a sudden change in circumstances. For example, we have we have a property that was on the tax rolls last year, generating, I think it's $22,000 in tax revenue. It's generating nothing now. So we're going to see that part of our revenue drop by $22,000. Those things happen. If a property goes into tax taking, it comes out of the revenue side. And those are the ups and down swings that we get. So it is important to, one, identify what we need. Let me rephrase that. What we have available through local receipts so we can determine how to manage the levy. The levy should always be looked at from a maximum standpoint because we can move those other figures. We can't change the levy.
The key, one of the things I think that I neglected to explain, that I wanted to explain, is how the tax rate is calculated. The assessor goes out and assesses all the properties in town, and we've all heard the discussions on that's gone out now that the tax bills have gone out. And the assessor comes up with a number for the town. You know, whatever whatever the number is. Because of Proposition 2.5, there's only so much of the formula is set up so that Proposition 2.5 works, and that is because they take the amount of the assessment, and then they take the amount of what your levy is calculated to be, and then they divide that to come up with the tax rate. So basically, whatever the assessment, if the assessment is doubled, the tax rate, the levy doesn't change, the tax rate changes. So basically, if we have a levy of, let's make it easy, of 25 million, and our assessment is 10 billion, that division comes up with the tax rate. If the assessment goes up here, the levy doesn't change. We still only collect that amount of money. What changes is how much of it is the tax rate, is how much of it, so the tax rate would go down. So basically, no matter how much the assessment goes up, Proposition 2.5 keeps it at that levy. We can't bring in any more. The only way we can is new growth.
What grows when we do that is the levy ceiling. The difference between what we're allowed to tax and what we can tax if we got a barrel of ether, brought everybody in, and said, here's what we want to spend. And that difference should be a healthy number. The closer the town comes between levy limit and levy ceiling is a real good indicator of whether or not you're in trouble. Because a couple of cities in this Commonwealth have actually hit their levy ceiling. And once you hit that, there's nowhere to go.
So
Doesn't matter what you vote, you can't raise your tax.
levy ceiling is the second part of Proposition 2.5 that nobody really
Right.
understands.
2.5
And the levy
of all
ceiling
value.
is basically 2.5% of your total assessment. So we don't have that problem. Our levy ceiling is $42 million, so we could actually have a $15 million override if we wanted to. The state will
Just heard
allow us.
100 ears perk up.
It's available.
But that is available by law. It won't pass, obviously. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of bring that out too, and thanks for mentioning that, Frank, because that's an important thing to think about. And that's why the new growth number really is the only thing at this point that allows us to have any change in the levy other than a 2.5 override.
And that new growth is what serves to reduce the assessment to everybody because it's spread out over more
Spreading it out more.
dollars.
So just another way to simply put it, assessed values do not increase the size of your pie,
Correct.
for anybody
What-
watching at home.
What
So-
it does do is changes the piece of everybody's pie.
Right.
So the pie's still the same size, but if your assessment went up, your pie's a little big, piece of the pie is a little bigger than your neighbor's maybe, but it's not, the pie is still the same size. So there's no more money in it, it's just,
Right,
You
it's
have a good-
essentially a zero-sum game, so if yours went up,
somebody else's.
Somebody else's went down.
Somebody else's size went down, yeah. I mean, I don't know of anybody's assessment that went down, but maybe there's
There
somebody
were
else.
some.
There was a couple?
There were some. I wasn't one of them.
I wasn't either.
Get calls and complaints about that, did you?
Surprisingly, no.
All right, so the next, and I don't want to call it a document because really this was created to make sure
No.
I was able to stay on track in this meeting, is the, so I'll call it a worksheet, the budget override discussion guideline. And that's what I would like to kind of use as the map for the rest of the meeting.
Did you hand that out, Randy?
It's in your
It's in your
packet.
packet. It's staple type piece.
And they'll, it was that big packet I gave you in the beginning of the meeting.
Yeah, I'll grab it. I have it.
And then there'll be some other documents we may refer to, which I've included for everyone. So recently I was asked, what is the charge of this committee? And basically, for myself, the charge of this committee was to determine if a Proposition 2.5 override would be necessary to maintain services and properly address the community's needs for this fiscal year and beyond. I think through the work we've done, we have gotten very close to maybe being able to answer a portion of that. We'll see as the meeting goes on. As many people out there know, we did have a consultant come in that the town hired, Mr. John Madden. I would like to thank him for the work that he did. I think it was excellent work that has given this town some new ideas to think about. It's given this board some direction on what we should recommend that other boards should adopt. One of his main findings that I took note in was since fiscal year 2015, our operating budget has increased annually by about 4.86%. He determined that these budget increases are simply not sustainable. On a positive note, he did say that for FY20 over a budget increase for FY20 over FY19 was about 3.1%. What he recommended was discipline and, in his words, a general reality check. He recommends increases more in line with other communities in the range of, for general services, in the range of 2% to 2.5%. What he did say about education was increases of 7% and 8% assessment to the town was not the norm, and he recommended a 5% assessment to the town. I don't want to beat up his summary, but I did include a bit in this that we should read. Going forward, what he determined was that he gave us a list of recommendations that if we should adopt, we would come very close to being able to get through this fiscal year. However, again, in his own words, he says even with the adoption of these principles and policies that an override may be, and again in his words, inevitable, albeit a much smaller override than the $5 million he originally talked about. Mr. Madden had a list of revenue recommendations that I believe this board should talk about, discuss, and vote to make recommendations whether or not to present them to the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee for adoption. Let's start with the first one. The ambulance account. The consultant's recommendation, at the next town meeting, dissolve or modify the existing fund effective 7/1/20. Create ambulance fund receipts for the purpose of purchasing an ambulance every 3 years, as well as a set of firefighter turnout gear every 3 years. To accomplish this, the first $160,000 of ambulance receipts should be deposited into a new and modified ambulance fund, RRFA. Additionally, allow the balance in the account to be carried forward year to year, a provision which, in the way the current article stands, we were not utilizing properly. The remainder of ambulance receipts would be deposited in the general fund, assuming ambulance collections totaled, on an average, they've been about $950,000. For projection purposes, calculate 85% of the collections, $807,500. Subtract the first $160,000, which is to be deposited in the ambulance funds receipt, RRFA fund. This would leave a projected contribution to the general fund of slightly less than $650,000. I believe his point of this was basically to serve as a revenue enhancer for the town. This comes as a major change, and I think something needs to be discussed at this point in length among the board, among this committee.
I would make a motion to accept this proposal.
Second. Discussion.
I would ask for the consideration to, looking at the wording of this, for those that sit on the budget and those that sit on the finance committee, we just purchased all new firefighting gear. It's good for 10 years. And looking at the capital improvement plan that the Collins Center put something together and stuff, and discussions with others, I would think that this would better serve the town if we created a separate account that this money went into, something like the fire department equipment and vehicle account. That would direct those funds to the capital needs for the replacement of an ambulance, which is due next year. It's replacing in 2010. We have a 2012 ambulance the following year that needs to be replaced, and this account's not going to cover those expenditures. I would ask that we look at somewhere in the lines of $200,000, not $160,000. Up that line a bit, establish that revenue account, 2, 10, 20, like whatever, like the thought process is. And that would establish a capital account for specific equipment and vehicles for the future.
Well, would it make more sense to vote on this or discuss this as a, something that I think we should do, an account that we should do, but I don't think that we should hamstring ourselves as a recommendation from us with a number on it, or I think that's for future decision to be decided, that if we are going to set this aside, whether it's 200,000 or not, and how it's going to be utilized, I think that's for other committees, for the selectmen and the FinCom, or both, or one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, right, there's not.
Conceptually, I think it's the thing to do.
From a policy perspective, I think it makes sense for us to make a recommendation. I'd be concerned about numbers because we're not talking about how we monitor the increase in the cost of an ambulance, right? So if we keep putting away 160 grand and then all of a sudden it's time to buy one and we find out that we undershot by $75,000-$80,000, right? That's a problem, and I would imagine that's feedback that the finance committee and the selectmen would want to take every year from the fire chief. With knowing it's not always going to be you going forward, right? So, I from my perspective, I would say we should be careful about how we recommend. I think the policy that we're recommending is, that we take Mr. Madden's recommendations into account and set up the appropriate vehicle to implement those recommendations, right?
Yeah, I agree.
The challenge for this is the mechanism. Right now, we have a process where all of the revenue goes into a reserve for appropriation account, and then each year, we vote to appropriate or transfer that money. In times gone by, we used to create reserve for appropriation purchase accounts, and the housekeeping may make this a little different. And I'm just thinking out loud right now. I understand the concept, I agree with the concept, but what we may want to do is define a sum of money, first in, to be reserved for appropriation, so that when the revenue starts to come in, and I'm a little hung up on how I'd phrase it right now, but what I would say is that I would identify X number of dollars from ambulance revenue shall be appropriated to a reserve for appropriation purchase account. And then the balance of the revenue is simply revenue. It retains our ability to reserve critically needed funds, but creates a revenue source for the other money. And the trick is, the challenge, I hate to use that word trick, the challenge is to identify what that number should be. Tim, what does an ambulance cost?
320,000.
So and I think that's where John came up with these numbers, because he did every 3 years.
But he's
in
not
reality,
taking into
we're already 8
consideration
years out on one of
You've
them.
got 2 ambulances, and they're going to continually rotate.
Right.
But that's, I said, I think policy-wise, conceptually-wise, I think we vote on this, but I think it's up to Tim to come back with you, Finance Committee, Selectmen, to explain what the actual need is and how often that need's going to be there. Because if you've got 2 ambulances and they, how close are they on their rotation schedule to being replaced? 160,000 isn't probably going to cut it.
What has
It could almost, I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
last year we did 950,000. What is kind of the average? I mean, where have we? What was the year before that? I mean, have we seen it gone up? I know there was discussion that we had before that the concern is that it might drop because of legislation, but put that aside for now. Are we seeing consistently that kind of money?
No, when you buy equipment, particularly when you buy equipment for fire service.
No, I think
I'm
John's
talking
about
revenue.
the revenue
The
side.
revenue.
Oh, the revenues,
So
I'm
in
sorry.
2008, I think our revenues were somewhere in the 500,000 range when I took over.
It's consistently risen.
Through ambulance billing and through new companies and rates, we've been able to build that up. It's been consistent at about the 900.
I mean, we're 6 months into 2020. How are we looking right now?
We're, I think, at about 500,000 right now.
500. So if we stay on that rate, we might be a little bit over what we did last year. So theoretically, I mean, the other thing that's talked about here is that you're only using 85% of the fund as a revenue source. So what's going to happen if we do allocate, say, 200,000 and we do $1 million, and we're only putting 650,000 into the general fund? What's going to happen with the other money that's left over that we didn't
Well,
use?
I think you would write that article to say, and have specific wording of no
Would
less
be in free
than X
cash.
amount of dollars. with the
But it's
remainder
got, how would it be in
general
free
fund.
cash if it's not in?
Because it's revenue. If you're not voting it as a
So
reserve
you would
account.
probably, so from a accounting standpoint, you would move it from one line item as a what's the word?
Go
From other available funds to a local receipts or something
Correct.
along that
It would be a
line.
local receipt. It is a local receipt in towns that don't have
An ambulance
for
fund.
appropriation account. The challenge here is going to be to identify a process, and I could see an article at town meeting to see if the town will vote to appropriate X number of dollars, and this is where we have to think it through, because it has to be there to appropriate. So you have to identify what you want to reserve up front.
Well, I would look at Mr. Madden's recommendation and say the way he has it written here is very solid, but we're talking about, is that number enough?
Right.
I mean, he's saying that the first,
I think it's for
the
another
first
committee to
160
figure
or
out.
the first 200,000 go into that account, and then the balance go to the general fund. So that account is all set until we decide to spend it, correct? So that we may not spend it that year, we may spend it the next year, and there's going to be 400,000.
At the end of the year, that the balance in the ambulance account at the end of the year would automatically dump.
That's the way it's currently set up.
Right, he's recommending that there be a provision added
So it-
to be able to carry it over.
An ambulance fund, RRFA, Frank, what does RRFA mean?
Reserved for,
Reserve for
Reserve for appropriation.
appropriate?
I guess.
Well,
mean, if we
I
said-
don't think
If we set
you
up a
don't need
fund,
revolving fund for that.
it wouldn't come in as free cash at the end of the year if that is set up to go into that reserve for appropriations account, and then at the end of the year, we didn't spend it, so it's going to carry over to the next year.
The difference in this is how we account for the money. When we go to town meeting in May, what we are going to spend out of the reserve for appropriation ambulance account is money that's already in there.
Correct.
If we discontinue the ambulance account, it's now general revenue, so we'd be voting to spend money based on local receipts.
Well, I don't think, that-
Which is-
Isn't RRFA restricted reserve for appropriation, that you can only use this money for
Yes.
Right.
what is
But I mean, that's what
listed in
we,
the article?
that's the intention of this, though, is to make that money available in the general fund, so that, I mean, it's going to end up funding pretty much what it funds now anyway in Article 2, because we took $500,000 of it last year straight to fund, salaries and
Operational cost.
operational costs. So it's really not changing. They're still going to get the funds. It's just not earmarked funds. I mean, we're still going to have to fund those line items, the ambulance billing and, all the stuff that we've been earmarking that fund for, still going to get funded in Article 2. Not going to change.
I think that's actually a good point. So if, assuming we follow this recommendation, a large chunk of that money last year went to funding operating expenses of the fire department. If we make this change, that money would then go to free cash, and we'd have to find other revenues within the operating budget to fund the fire department, which, per some of Mr. Madden's other recommendations,
It's
would not
going
be
in
free
as
cash.
revenue.
It's going as revenue.
It's not going to be free cash until we don't use it.
I see.
So it's going to show as revenue, and then we're going to use,
It's going to be in.
What we're doing now is we're getting into the semantics of how it works.
Right. And which is
I
going to
think we
drag
need
this
to
on.
just come to a conclusion as to what our intent is and then develop the
So
language.
Before we come to a conclusion, I just want to remind everybody that the way the article is currently written and approved at past town meetings is that the ambulance account was set up in a way that allowed for capital expenditures for the fire department, and all that money was all the remaining money each year was supposed to go into the general fund.
Correct.
That currently isn't being done right now.
Correct.
And secondly, Mr. Madden's recommendation was based on why he focused on an ambulance, because he was trying to make the distinction between large capital items, large expenditures that are considered capital items versus large expenditures which are not. And it's my understanding that turnout gear would not be considered a capital item. It's expenditure, but it would not be considered a capital item. He made that distinction between capital items and non-capital items, like vehicles, for instance.
Right, he was saying these are large purchases that you have to do
put them in your
on a
budget.
regular basis. Really, what he's saying is probably too big to include in your operating budget, really not large enough for a capital. That's where these accounts, restricted accounts should really be used.
Right.
And this is where it made sense. And I think he had even said, be great if you could fund a cruiser that way, but everyone's going to balk if you're funding a cruiser through motor vehicle violations pool, right? So, we certainly don't want to go back to those days. So I think the way it's written, to Randy's point, makes sense. I think what this really gets down to is kind of two things. He's recommending that we change the article as currently written, because the article is currently written. We're not necessarily following it correctly. And then two, I think folks have said here, I think we're, in my mind anyway, I'm not looking to recommend that the number be 160,000 at this point. I think that requires further a further in-depth dive. I think that the Finance Committee and the Selectmen will be in a better position to do that in this upcoming process. And hey, if right now we're on a cycle where these things have to be replaced kind of back to back, that may drive a slightly different calculation in year 1 and year 2 and year 3 than we eventually want to get to, right? And there's no reason why working together, the Selectmen and the Finance Committee could make a recommendation to start that number higher and phase it in over time, or whatever is appropriate from a funding perspective. So I personally wouldn't want to try to come up with a number today. My thought is that we recognize that this is a good policy and a good recommendation, and one that we encourage or recommend that the Board of Selectmen take up.
So maybe another way to put it would be adopt the policy with a funding amount to be determined by the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee.
So I have a motion to adopt that policy with a...
Second.
Whatever you just said.
It's something to be determined by the Board of Selectmen
And the Finance Committee.
ultimately by
the fire
town meeting.
chief.
Yeah, and maybe the fire chief would throw some input in there too. Okay, well, I cannot make that motion, so.
Well, I just did, and he seconded it.
Second, all right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
It's unanimous.
Ernie, I see you sitting back there, and I don't know why,
Just here in case a capital item comes up.
okay. Do you want to address that now?
It's not on the agenda piece, but I know it's been floating around.
It's under capital, so I don't want to have, this meeting is going to take a bit, and I hate to have them sitting here all night.
So I think one of the issues, and Don and I have talked a little bit, and the issue has come up about the Duval School roof. And I'll be presenting at school committee a little bit of information on Wednesday. But last week, we were going to go and do an SOI on the Duval School roof because the clawback time to repair that roof was 20 years. Well, when Ernie talked to Desi, they've changed that to 27 years. So we can't apply for an SOI to cover that roof project, and the MSBA won't help us at this point, this year. Now, what we talked between ourselves, that could change next year as well. It could change to 25 years, it could change to 22 years. We don't know. We don't know why necessarily that it changed to 27. Ernie, did Jen tell you anything about why it
I think
changed?
the volume of applicants, there's I guess a large group that have come to that 20-year, just like Duval Roof, Conley, have come to that 20-year threshold, and they're all putting the applications in for accelerated programs. Jeff and I talked about this today. One of the things when you look at Duval Roof, that project, Conley and Whitman Middle were all done at the same time. We could probably apply for either one. So I think that's what's happening with a lot of towns out there.
Where are we at? What year are we at?
This was year 20.
This is 20.
So this is why we were kind of holding it off. Ernie, the 2015 is when we found the issues with the roof, really?
Yeah, so you probably all know the history with the, just about everybody around had some freeze-ups in 2015. Similar to, Jeff and I were talking about this, he was cooking out on Saturday outside, I was too. 2015, I think I was cooking on my grill just around Christmas time, and then all of a sudden, all hell broke loose. So at that time, we had the freeze-ups, and I'm repeating myself because I've mentioned this many times. The insurance company paid for all the interior repairs, but would not take care of the exterior, solving the problem. And that's when we approached the town. So, in looking at the history where we're at, for as far as the interior condition of Duval, we do air quality tests, and if we see a leak, we take care of it. And we've also done, after the initial architectural testing, they identified a lot of areas that we needed to work on and take care of. There were seams that on that PVC roof that had to be redone. We've done that. We've caulked windows. We've done a whole bunch of stuff. I think we've taken care of any of the obvious things right now, and hopefully we don't have another 2015 the next 3 or 4 years, but right now, the building's somewhat dry. And I worried about it, yesterday, the way the wind was blowing, the northeast winds tend to affect that building. I checked it today. We didn't have the tiles all over the place that have moisture in them. So anyways, that's the history, that's the short history on Duval.
So and then just a little bit more to add to that history. In 2016, the town did a warrant article for about $335,000 to repair this roof. In 2017, another $300,000 through town meeting was approved for repair of the roof. So currently, I believe we have about, after some testing and to figure out what the problem was, I believe there's about $543,000 left in the encumbered funds for that roof project.
That is correct.
So if we're looking at possibly getting through some funds are there, obviously, we don't want to put a $500,000 Band-Aid on this project. Are you confident that within our encumbered funds, reasonably, should be able to get through fixing this project, possibly?
That's the $1 million question.
Yeah, I guess it is, because we've talked about, and quite frankly, I think I maybe sat in this room talking about this roof project multiple times. And you know, the way we're looking at it, and I was surprised, I think we're all surprised that it went from 20 years to 27, because this was going to be the easiest SOI I ever wrote. Because I had the documents, I had the architectural plans, I was just going to fill in the blanks, and I was excited to get it done. And then when I talked to Jen Flynn from the state, and she had said that it increased, I was like bummed out, told Jeff. And the way I've been looking at it is if we had to wait 2 or 3 years for funding to come through, as long as we had money, seed money, to take care of leaks. I'll give you a good example. When the architect, Gale Engineering, looked and did the destructive testing, they said these things really need to get fixed right away. It'll help us out. So we spent probably out of our operating budget around $4,600 with Gibson Roof and College Town Glass. We dispatched them over there to take care of specific things that needed to be done. Well, that was out of our operating budget. I know our ceiling before we get reimbursed from both towns is around $5,000, but we don't operate that way. Whatever the quote is, the quote is. We don't ask them to increase it to get it $5,000. But our thing was that if we're going to continue to wait, we cannot get a bunch of $4,500 hits. So if we collectively came up with a earmark, just like the ambulance fund I was listening to, we have a dollar amount that's set there, and if we do have issues that show up, we identify them, we get quotes for them, and we get reimbursement for it. Anything within our operating budget, obviously we're responsible for, but anything over, obviously there's got to be an account established, whether it's a capital expenditure that goes over multiple years until, like Jeff said, we don't know if it's going to change next year from, it will go back to the 20 years or go to 22 years. I think every year, and I asked the question, if I filled out the application and sent it in tomorrow, would it be accepted? And the person from the state that we deal with said no, it would be rejected. You just have to, it's that window that they want, there's certain things, and they see those projects coming down the pipe, they know whether it's going to be the 22, 25, or 27 years. So, Randy, to answer your question, whatever money you have, $500,000, I think if there's a portion of that money that's set aside for the repairs to the Duval roof, I would feel better about it. I know Jeff would feel.
How did the article
better.
read that appropriated the money?
Well, the money is available right now for the roof, for work on the roof.
Well, specifically for repair and replacement, or?
Yeah. What we probably would do is in May, identify a sum of money that we want to retain in a working article to support repairs. to the roof over a period of time. And then would they possibly move the difference into a capital reserve account?
So you're saying in May, do an article that's funded by that 500,000 that we
Yes.
already have?
Transfer a portion of that money into a roof maintenance account for the DeVal. And, I mean, we could leave the money appropriated where it is, or we could move it into capital stabilization with the recognition that that money is intended to ultimately support.
So the question that I have is
Roof
what's
repairs.
the estimate to repair the roof? And secondly, how much would the state reimburse us?
I think,
Zero right now.
No. When in year 27?
I think it's about a $1.2 million project.
And what's, yeah, it by then, yeah.
And I believe the MSBA clawback is about 40%, give or take.
40%. So 1.2.
It's safe.
So would be, so we would still need more money, even if we had that 500,000.
Correct.
But we
still
were
leave-
close.
Would
We
be
were
close. Yeah.
if MSBA was going to let us go
Yeah.
ahead with it right now.
Yeah, we'd be
having
close.
That money was
40.
ideal if MSBA was to let us move forward, because it would more than satisfy our
And it would fix the
Our
problem.
share.
And it would fix all the roof.
If we plan on repairing this for the next couple of years until we see what the clawback time comes to, are we actively monitoring for environmental, health, and safety concerns within the? Okay.
That's a good question. Yeah, we're a little bit more aggressive with, we do air quality tests twice a year district-wide.
Okay.
And we've used those for applications on SOIs. We've actually documented, Whitman Middle is a good example. We documented poor air quality, and we just don't let it ride out poor air quality. We address the poor air quality. In Duval situation, if it's mold, we address the situation. We address if a teacher complains, after we've done all our base air quality tests, if a teacher or a staff member complains that there is a funny smell in the room, you can guarantee within 4 hours, we have somebody over there scheduled to do an air quality test in that specific room. And we use history to kind of look at, okay, what is the air quality now? What time of day was it? What was the temperature outside? What were the conditions? So we kind of use all of that for our advantage, because those questions are asked all the time, and we want to have the historical data to back it up.
The actual money on hand right now is $541,858.50.
What was that, Frank?
541,858.50.
All right, so do you think,
I'm sorry, I have a question. So if we were to go forward and, set aside money for repairs, and that's the plan, if this project, how would it be reflected on the capital matrix going forward? Because
It would still be a future project for
the roof would still-
replacement of the roof and the ephes, the front structure, right, Ernie?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
all right,
Thank you.
all set?
Thank you, Randy.
All right. All right, so continuing on. Thank you, Ernie. Motor vehicle fine account.
We want to vote that as a recommendation.
I don't really see why that's part of this.
No, it's not part
It
of it.
really isn't.
Well,
And it's a good idea. I think Finance Committee probably could discuss it.
Well,
Well, it's going to be an article that's going to come up. It's not going to be within our budget anywhere. It's money that already exists.
But I think it's,
and it is, that was part of our, I believe on the Collins report, a borrowing article. So we had two for this year that involved borrowing that we're going to, so I think it was good to discuss that one and get a game plan. And I'm sure as in the next couple of school committee meetings, a number will be hatched out. And so you did want to, I mean, I guess we probably would not need to vote on that, Frank, because
Right.
that would just
Yeah, I
be
don't think
transfer a
It'll
sum of
just-
money
Yeah,
from encumbered funds to possibly the board having to create a fund by article.
Right, and that's what we're gonna talk about financially through the Finance Committee and the Board of Selectmen in any event. The question being, do we leave it encumbered for a period of time, or do we transfer that excess into the reserve capital stabilization account for future
I mean,
purposes?
if they need to make repairs and we have the money, I think it's only fair that we.
Yeah, no, I'm saying segregate what we need.
I think that's the key, is to figure out how much they think they need, and then come up with an article and tell me to
And I
transfer.
think whatever that number is, we probably add 10 or 15% of it to be safe.
Right.
It's already appropriated money. I wouldn't want to
Yeah.
cut it short and then create a crisis later.
Well, we also don't want to try to keep as much as we can for when the time comes when we can do the right process.
Right,
I think we're
and,
gonna have to go
Right,
back
what we don't
eventually.
spend remains encumbered.
and that's where, personally, I think, hearing this
Safest
now,
place for
you
it
do
is where
walk
it
a
is.
fine line
Sure.
that you're not going to put a $400,000 Band-Aid on this project, knowing that you're going to rip that Band-Aid off when you go to,
Do
I
it
guess,
right.
fix it properly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, what the ask is if we know we're deferring the long-term solution, then, do we do what we can to take it out of the operating budget so that it doesn't affect other items that come up for the schools, right? And-
Again, it
and
would have to
designate
come out of
money.
our capital or operating budget in order to go to the school's capital
Correct.
Well,
expense.
I think what you're saying is, should that, knowing we're making repairs, should 4,600 here, 4,600 there be coming out of the, that's, I don't think so, especially when we have funds.
If the article on the appropriation allows for what's been going on to take the money out, safest place for that money is to stay right where it is, because it's the only thing it can be used for.
Right.
Moving anywhere else, time goes by, people, other than us,
Table,
are making
right.
decisions.
But if the question is then, how does the district submit, like, reimbursement or
Right
payment
now,
for
we
those,
have the
you know?
ability to reimburse for expenses related to the roof and EFS.
Fair enough.
Okay, moving on to another one of Mr. Madden's recommendations was the motor vehicle fine account. Very much along the same lines as the ambulance account, where basically you're taking money coming into the town and putting it towards general revenue. The issue with this was, I believe, Frank, this is how a large portion of our TASER program, I think, was being funded.
Actually, last year, we chose not to use this money to fund the tasers because of the image it presents. I mean, it just, we're going to pull somebody over, write them a ticket so we can tase them the next. I mean, that's not the intent.
All right.
So it's such a small number now that I'm not sure that we benefit from having a reserve for appropriation fine account. It still has the connotations and image that we're ticketing people to make money, but we're really not.
So the recommendation
Is to
is
dissolve.
just to put it into general fund, but did you have to do special legislation to
Yes,
get?
so we have to-
So does this cause a problem with that?
I believe, and we talked about this the last time, and I haven't had a chance to follow it up, but I will. I believe we can rescind our acceptance of that legislation.
And yet it can still stay within our general revenue?
Yes, it would.
Like the
Most
idea
people-
when we got the special legislation, wasn't it to use it?
It wasn't to enhance revenue, it was to direct revenue to the police department.
Right, so,
So that money would normally be going into our general fund as local receipts, fines and fees.
All right, so then I'll read this in its entirety. In June of 1990, town meeting voted to petition the state legislature to create a separate motor vehicle fines receipts reserved for appropriation fund. Monies in this fund could then be used to defray salary costs of the police department and approved at town meeting. Additionally, this fund would be accounted for and invested separately, retaining any interest earned Over the last 5 years, the fund has collected an average of $52,040 annually. However, during the period that Mr. Madden analyzed, no funds were used to defray salary expenses in the operating budget. Rather, an average of $49,743 has been used annually to provide funding for the police department's capital requests. It is not known what the financial condition of the town was when this fund was created. However, the town, Mr. Madden states, the town's currently in a position where it is starved for general revenue. And that's what a transfer of this, or dissolution of this fund would do, would again be adding by average about.
I make a motion at the next town meeting to dissolve the existing fund effective July 1st, 2020.
All in favor? Unanimous?
Probably should have had discussion first, but that's okay.
I think we had discussion.
You beat that horse.
Don't make me bang the gavel, John. Okay, sewer, water, and direct costs. Again, a consultant recommendation to increase a steady stream of revenue to the town. The town assesses the Water Sewer Enterprise Fund for services performed in the general fund on behalf of the enterprise fund. Currently, these indirect costs are not accounted for in the general fund during the budget process. Instead, these funds are transferred at year end, eventually converting to free cash. And as previously discussed, that seems to be the problem, that they go to free cash and are not continuing revenue. So for FY21, funding for these indirect costs amounted to $512,300. Over the previous 5 years, this figure has increased by slightly more than 5%. The benefit of doing this would be to reduce the reliance on taxation to fund the entire Article 2. By supplementing the operating budget with these funds, an equal amount of levy can be used elsewhere and to fund various other budgetary increases.
Motion to accept.
Motion to accept. Second, do I hear a second? Discussion.
Okay, one of the things that, and John concurred in our last presentation, one of the areas of concern is this process feeds $500,000 in free cash each year, which in turn is available for capital and one-time expenses. If we make this change, there will be a $500,000 drop in free cash.
Which is currently at $1.9 million.
1.9 this year, typical.
Yeah.
If I were to average it out, it'd probably be between $1 million and $1.1 million over a long period of time. So it would cut free cash in half.
But the money's in.
The money would be in the operating
revenue side,
budget.
in the operating budget, and then can be used in.
So over the last 5 years, and these aren't my numbers, we've used $850,000 last year, $1 million in 2019, $882 in 2018, $610 in 2017, and $1.1 in 2016. That's money that we put into the used in at town meeting or voted to expend at town meeting. So we're basically on average under $1 million
Yes.
using
Well-
free cash at town meeting. So the
Yeah.
question is, where would, and I know that's a whole nother topic of discussion for this on where we use free cash, but I think in doing this, even though, yes, we are taking a engine from free cash, it's so much more valuable right now to us in the general fund, so that we can fund
Operations.
operations.
If best
yeah.
practice is to use free cash for one-time expenses, what this is kind of the reverse, where it takes recurring revenue and places it into free cash.
Correct.
Best practice would be to put this back into the
Put
operating
this
budget.
back, because it is something that's recurring every year, and we should be using it every year, and it'll help us a lot.
We just have to be prepared to rely on less free cash available.
Next year will be
That's an
shocked.
objective of ours anyway, isn't it?
Well, to put it more directly,
Use
what you
less
guys
people.
are saying in between the lines is it's going to take fiscal responsibility by department heads
not to grab that 500,000 for other things.
Well, in the past, that 500,000 contribution to free cash helped to pay for the debt for the police station, town hall, and fire station. That's now,
Which amounted
Excluded.
is 700,000?
yep. So that takes the pressure off the need to have free cash.
This will be the first year going into it that's,
This will be the second
so
year. we
it'll
actually-
almost be
yeah,
a
we
wash,
did it last
right?
year.
No, we did it last year, but this,
This will be the first year we plan our budget knowing that
we don't have.
We don't have-
We don't
that
have it
it's
because
You
excluded.
don't have that liability in free cash.
This would actually be a good sum
it'd
of
be a
money.
good time to do it.
This would be
Yeah,
a
it
good sum
would
of money for the finance committee to start recommending departments start bringing their recurring capital expenses within their operating budgets. Things like cruisers, tasers.
Whose is tough?
It's tough, but
That is, that, I
know that
don't
we're ready for
necessarily
that
agree
yet.
with that.
John noted that.
And we're
21
not
would
buying
probably
cruisers,
lease
we're
first.
leasing
I don't
them,
know that
so.
we're ready for
yeah.
that yet.
We're gonna have to, I mean,
goal.
I'm all for buying them.
It's gonna be a bullet we have to bite at some point.
at some point we'll have
I'm
to
not, we're ready.
get there.
Don't rub it in.
All right,
At
so,
least tasers.
tasers definitely.
I personally think it was pretty clear we need revenue. And this is a continuing revenue source.
So I have and maybe it isn't a topic for us, but in the discussions that Mr. Madden had with us, right now, that money does not become available until the end of the year. So the article we would need to set up would need to have a driving engine in that money gets transferred out of that account during the year, during the fiscal year, so that it actually does get used. So by the end of the year, it's out of the account. Whereas right now, it sits in the account until the end of the year, and it's free cash. So our article would need to be set up in a way to transfer the money into the general fund at, I don't know if we can do it at the beginning of the
Quarterly?
year, or maybe quarterly, or,
No, what you'd have to do is, you would have to do an offsetting appropriation at town meeting. And again, this is something with mechanics now. We have to reduce our levy appropriation by the amount of money that we're choosing to take from the indirect costs, because it's money in another budget. So we would use that as an offset to the cost of Article 2, for example.
Okay.
So if Article 2 was $30 million, to raise and appropriate $29,500,000, and to appropriate $500,000 from enterprise revenue to fund the budget, and the language ought to be cleaned up, but we're actually going to be appropriating revenue from the enterprise to,
there isn't a way we can't get it into I'm not saying local receipts, but maybe other available funds, create, I mean,
it's going to have to be a vote because it's coming from a different fund. It's not coming from the general fund.
I
It's
mean,
coming-
theoretically, it's a
coming from the
service that the
enterprise.
town is providing for the enterprise fund.
Right, so it's an offset. But it would have to be voted to use enterprise funds to compensate for revenue. And John had kind of made that,
Yeah, he does kind of,
Statement of how
in
to
the
do it.
recommendation, he does
but we
say,
have to clarify it.
I was just gonna say, I'm sure we can reach out to him to get
Yeah.
some,
We can get whatever language we need if this is what we want to do. So I guess the motion would have to be to support the recommendation.
that was my motion.
you made that motion?
I did.
I second it.
Okay?
All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous?
Yes.
Jeff, did you go? Yes. Okay. Operating budget recommendations. As presented in Mr. Madden's report, he specifically said that the town must make a more conscious effort to keep departmental increases in line with new growth. His I put down what his recommendations were for town operations. He recommended up to, but not to exceeding, a 2.5 overall budget increase. For education, up to, but not to exceed, a 5% assessment increase as it fell to Whitman. So I did make some side notes here, and please don't think I was putting this document I put together mainly for myself to try and keep on point here this evening. What we do need to think about is, as we make these, if we make a recommendation, is there may obviously be some exceptions to these rules. And that the Finance Committee definitely will need to be given the proper latitude to deviate from this. And you're making a general recommendation. Real quick one that came to my top of my head as I was typing it out was, we have a presidential election coming up this year. But when that happens, the clerk's budget rises considerably for a year, so probably will be pushed out beyond a 2.5% increase. And that was just one that I came up quick, but I would...
Well, a similar line item would be solid waste disposal. I mean, that's something that we can't control.
It's an uncontrollable, the county retirement, for example.
Yeah,
We're at 9%.
Right.
So I think the language should be where controllable. And then the other part of that is, when we have to exceed those numbers in one area of the budget, we have to find ways to make it up in others, because we still have, as John refers to it, a hard stop. There's a limit on how much we can spend, and if we have to spend more in that area, then we have to find ways to conserve it. I mean, that's really where we are right now.
So if the recommendation is 2 and 5, I would look for a motion on that.
I'll make a motion to support that
Second.
recommendation to set those guidelines.
Well,
Guidelines.
just to properly open up the discussion on this. And then as we move down, so this should have been wrapped in, but obviously we need to talk about, I'm sure there's some people that right now are panicking when we say 5% assessment of the school this year. But if anyone's been paying attention, we obviously have had a recent assessment change, not only recommended at the selectman level, the finance committee level, and now at the school committee level. That adds some complexity to this issue. The town of Whitman sees some relief in fiscal year '21, and what I would say to the finance committee is, I personally think we should be funding at least a required budget, but they need to take into strong consideration what this will be doing to our partner community and what sustainability is beyond FY '21. In your packet, you have a document that is a complete draft document of numbers that I ran. It's based off last year's DESI numbers, so by no means is this concrete. And if everyone just kind of looks at it, that will give you an idea of what Whitman's payment may be for the required and then the required and restore budget. But let's go back to talking about the motion on the floor here of 2.5 and 5. So discussion on that.
Obviously, we're a board put together to make recommendations. The finance committee will have the say in what goes to the floor of town meeting, and town meeting has the final say in what happens. But I think these are good guidelines presented by a consultant that we brought in to help set these rules. Something that we should push for every year.
Yeah, I mean, the consultant specifically pointed out that if we were to adopt these recommendations and guidelines, in 2.5% increases in general through these departments, keep them in good shape. We're not asking any department to give anything up. And we're not diminishing services in any way. In some cases, we'll probably be enhancing services. And by doing so and adopting these recommendations and guidelines, we find that we're not in a position that we need an override. So that's pretty important. And I think we could also see when we did the trend analysis that, we would have benefited by following some of these guidelines all along, as tough as it would be. But we definitely have to put them in place for now, for at least this year, and for this budget cycle. And going forward, the Finance Committee and the Board of Selectmen are gonna have to figure out what they wanna do.
Yeah, I think I concur with Scott. At the very least, if we implement these recommendations, it gives us a good base on on what to do next year and the following years after.
What was brought up in the Finance Committee meeting with the school committee last week, I think should be discussed about here a little bit more in detail, in that this, and Mr. Chairman brought it up earlier, that this is a very difficult year because of the transition to the statutory method. And going a full 5% for us, for the school, is obviously doable for us, but it puts even more pain and suffering, to use the words, for the town of Hanson. They have to, because what we spent last year we cannot spend any less for the school. They have to match that just to start, and that's a 20% assessment increase for them. To go to 5% is a 25% increase. Though we all would love to do that right now, again, I don't think our partners are in a position to do that, but that's really not for this meeting, this board to decide. I think that is definitely a Finance Committee meeting and Board of Selectmen meeting discussion, but I just did want to bring it up. I think it's important to consider that, this year it may not be 5% for the school.
Well, I think there's some factors that I don't want to toss out a blanket statement, because I think that there's some changes where people might see out there that you are relating previous assessment numbers to what the schools asked for on Whitman, and it's going to change considerably.
Very true.
So I think with school funding, you really are going to need to wait until you see probably somewhere around the end of the month.
Numbers should be coming out from the state at the 3rd to 4th week of January.
Right. And that's going to...
So we'll have that for our 5th meeting on the 5th. School committee budget rollout on
February 5th?
We should. The state promises the numbers, we'll have those numbers. It's easy enough to do, but we have to use those numbers to calculate it.
Right.
There's a couple things I think about from this committee's perspective, and I guess at this point, we don't have all the numbers. I don't think it's this committee's place to make recommendations that specifically tie or try to take the place of the Finance Committee working with department heads, right? It's this committee's place to make recommendations to the Board of Selectmen and to the Finance Committee to put discipline around how we budget going forward. So I believe that we should be making a recommendation that the town adopt, a financial policy that gives those committees recommendations around what are to be considered reasonable and sustainable budget increases going forward. I don't know if for 2021, 2.5 and 5 is the right number. I think you could make the argument that in the school's case, it could be more than 5, right? Depending on the way the numbers come in and what happens with statutory, et cetera. Or maybe you'd want to approach, some one-time costs to do things like school start times and other things, right? So I hesitate to put a hard and fast number around it. I think I think it makes sense to recommend, the policy going forward. Maybe with the caveat that given the current assessment situation, and I think this committee should take note that we recognize, or at least I would want to recognize, that our school system is lacking programs and has lost programs in recent years that towns around us have. And as a resident, I would consider necessary for the schools to have. And so I think as part of that discipline, I think we also have to recognize that, within the next X number of years, there should be a concerted effort to put something in place to properly fund those programs. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen within it's not going to happen within a 5% school assessment increase anyway, right? We're talking about
with everything you just said.
Yeah.
The problem with the process is we can tie Whitman Hanson to 5% by sheer vote. We can't do that to South Shore. We can't do that to Norfolk Aggie because we don't have those controls. And it would be frustrating to me to see one system being well-funded and another system being penalized because of circumstance. At the same time, we're trying to come up with a recommendation on the study that we commissioned Mr. Madden to do, and the sum total of the findings is what validates the recommendation. When we start picking and choosing, and you know how quickly I conceded that free cash item. When we start picking and choosing, then it mitigates the impact. Our vote here is symbolic. We vote to accept this recommendation. We don't have the authority to limit the town to 5%, but what we're saying is that as a part and parcel of this,
We're recommending to the Finance Committee and the Select Board to
What I
follow
want to be
these
careful
guidelines.
of, though, is Mr. Madden made his recommendations, assuming that departments were appropriately funded and offered the appropriate services for a town of this size, right? And so I think it's I don't want to say it's dangerous, but I don't know that it's appropriate to say in year 1, 2.5 and 5 are the right recommendations. I'd like to see, if we're really talking about financial planning, I'd like to see the committees responsible for that come up with a plan to get to 2.5 and 5, or to flat out say, you know what, we're good where we are,
But
right? That's the message we want to say.
His recommendation in what he had found, the matrix that he put together at the end, said if you follow these, if you keep it this year to 2.5 and 5, you're going to be fine. People, if that works. Now it may not work. Maybe we look at this and say, we tried, 2.5 and 5 doesn't work. We're going to be a little off that. Then there's an override number that's going to come out. If we do keep it at 2 and 5, and we find that it does work, and it's not the charge of this committee at that point, but the recommendation is to try and do that to the other committees, and if they can do it, the next step is we do need an override the next year. That is inevitable. That we can't brush that aside or put that under the rug or whatever. That the following year we still looked like in that matrix still look like we're going to need one, and it's less, but that burden's only going to grow. So, even if we followed it with his numbers, even if we followed again next year with 2.5 and reduced, kept the school at 5, we would be looking at an override, period.
I think we need an override this year.
We don't. We're not,
If we're talking about putting $500 back in the revolving account from sewer and water, and you talk about funding capital items out of there.
that's just because it's good practice to do it that way. That wasn't.
Sure. And that's not going to go towards operating budgets. I think we need to look back to step one of this plan to look at the budget after May 2018 town meeting, and a community survey was done. And look at what the community was willing to fund in an override. And those three things were public safety, police, fire, and schools. If we need that in the operating, we need that for an override. That should be looked at. 5%, I think Mr. Madden was saying 5% of a school budget from a municipality. And we know that that is full school budget, not half of a school budget, which $24 million, Chapter 70. State aid we get for the school budget.
So if we fund 5% to the school, that's a 25% assessment increase for the town of Hanson.
Yes.
Do you honestly think that that will come anywhere close to getting passed in the town of Hanson?
What I know is that this town of Whitman sacrificed $800,000 took that to fund the school budget 2 years ago. I think that was 2018. That year we said we should have an override. And I know that this funding formula of statutory method should have been implemented
That is,
a long time ago.
I
So,
don't disagree with that.
I'm focusing on Whitman.
My question is that in funding 5% for the schools right now, or 13% to get them everything, that's a $3.5 million increase for Hanson. That's, I mean, just to get them to fund what's required is going to be a challenge in Hanson, and I don't see that to be something that we.
Well, I think this is where I'm kind of getting to. There are a whole bunch of complications this year.
And timing is a big part of this.
And there's not a lot of time, even putting Hanson aside, there's not a lot of time to run a successful override campaign between now and May. And I don't know that you have the people lined up to do it, just my personal opinion. We're in a place today where I think from a school standpoint, and I don't know what the committee's going to ask for, if a budget will even get out of committee based on what I heard watching the Hanson Board of Selectmen meeting. What I would say though is I think we're talking about, making a recommendation that the town adopt a fiscal policy that has guidance for its FinCom and for the Board of Selectmen in the way that they move forward with the recommendations that they make for the operating budget, both, school and non-school. I'm not sure. Mr. Madden came up with those numbers. I believe they're probably right. He made an informed decision. I think going forward, it's something to strive for. I think we just need to recognize in the first few years there may need to be rebalancing that's done. Separate and aside from that, I think, looking at the numbers that we had asked Jeff for that he presented, there are things there, again, whether it be kind of one-time costs that maybe we Whitman can look at, or increases where we have to say to Hanson, yeah, well, we have the ability to put it in, and it really will be up to the school committee to ask for and approve the budget Jeff gets, and then we all know what can happen from there when it comes to whether or not that budget gets approved, and whether or not it goes to town meeting, and whether or not it goes to a super town meeting, and whether or not it goes to state control. Those are things that are out of our control. My personal opinion would be, I would hope anyone elected to a school committee would vote for a budget that the superintendent feels is necessary from both towns, regardless of the funding method. I think that's their job.
Well,
But I want to, it's separate, but it's important here, right? The finance committee will then have to make a decision about what Whitman can afford and what we should put in front of our town meeting. And we go from there. I do believe to restore programs, both in the schools and within the town, we will need an operating override at some point. I don't think it has any shot of passing either town if we were to recommend one for this year. I don't think we're ready for it. I really don't.
I find it interesting that members on the committee would want to follow the 5% for schools, but not this year. So it's just really tough. This chart right here is, the red line is your chapter 70.
Wait a second, time out, okay? Because now we're getting outside we are talking about what we're going to fund for the school this year. One, he has not presented a budget of what he is going to ask for, okay? We have 3 different budgets, all right? So we still don't know. We don't know what money's coming in. And what this committee's tasked with is, are we going to seek an override for this year and beyond? Now, I will tell you, I could get in and go off track of if we're going to start talking about what we're going to do as far as Hanson. But I'll tell you, if there's any school budget, Hanson needs a override. Hanson needs to be a major player in this. So the only thing I'm going to say, and then we're going to move on, we're going to vote this, is what people need to be very cognizant of is that every extra dollar, now I believe, you know what? It's not Hanson's fault we're in this position. It's the school committee's problem we're in this position. And not you, Don, because you weren't on then, but people should have recognized this. And when it was brought up previously, and I've said this over and over again, it should have been looked at then. It was a lot less dollar amount. Hanson's and I will be the first one to sit in those meetings and say, I know this is not your fault. You shouldn't be in this position. But what could possibly happen is, yes, I'll tell you right now, at 5%, a 5% assessment will give a very healthy budget where you will see growth in the school system this year. We haven't said that in the past previous years. Well, Whitman's in a position where you will see growth. You will not be going back. But you need to be very cognizant of the fact of what this will do. Now, if we want to stand by our guns, and I don't think the taxpayers of Whitman should need to pay more for Hanson, but be very cognizant of the fact that if we push them to the edge, you are walking closer and closer to fiscal control for the district. And that's what I meant with my statement, is you need to be very aware of what you're going to do for Hanson there. Because Justin and I have sat in these meetings, and we are trying to work with them. But if you push them to an edge, would maybe even benefit them to say, we're going to go to fiscal control. And I do not want to see that. I don't think anybody in this room wants to see that. What we're voting on, I would think with this motion, is something saying we're offering some stability. 2.5, you know what? Let's go by best practices. We should not be growing at 5% for our town departments. We cannot sustain that. What do we know? That 10, 11% is unsustainable at the school end. Now, I'll tell you, Ed, yes, do we need to get to a point where 5% from the town of Whitman is where we should be assessment-wise? Yes. Might we need an override to correct the things to get us to that point where that becomes the number? I don't think we would be there at that point this year, and I also think we need that our partner community to be on board with us to get to that number. So we have a motion and a second. I'll take a vote.
How does that motion read again?
Just put the recommendations of the consultant, which read up to but not exceeding a 2.5% overall budget increase. Education up to but not exceeding a 5%.
And I will say, Donna, if you want to bring your numbers out at this point, what 5% what looks like, you can do that.
My numbers? I don't know what you mean
Okay.
by that.
All right, then we'll take the vote.
I think I just want to make a comment, Chairman, in regard to sustainability of the budget. If the assessment to Whitman were not 5% this year, I think that greatly affects the sustainability of our planning alone, because you're now sort of reducing that increase this year. And this is the anomaly, and Chris George was right, you know, all these different factors, so it kind of skews the numbers these years. If we don't stay on track, even with this 5%, so I would support this recommendation, especially for this year, 5%, because if we were less, like we're looking at, I think what we're talking about is maybe a $200,000 increase to the Whitman assessment because of this large shift to the Hanson side. But then the following FY22, I don't know if anyone's looked at projections out, how that sort of levels out again and what gets put back into Whitman's lap for the assessment. It skyrockets. It goes back to what that average level would have been. And it's hard to explain, I know, without real numbers. I don't have a PowerPoint here to show it, and to talk numbers can get confusing. I don't know, the thing that I put together, this is the assessment that's been for the past 15 years. This is, red line is your Chapter 70, it flatlines. The black line is what we've done for the town, just to the district. And it goes up and down. This was an override year. This was that 800,000 from free cash. Otherwise, it's, and the fact that it just up and down, so I would support I would support something that does give the district something to look at and count on every year. That I believe in that.
So, I mean, I agree with the recommendation, and then I think it's up to the school committee to come in, finance committee, and the selectmen to figure it out from there. But I think the recommendation
Any
from this
department that
stands.
needs something above and beyond these numbers, they're gonna have to come in with a case,
Yeah.
right? These are guidelines
You'll have to
anyway.
make a case to the town meeting.
And what this is doing, is it sending a signal that we are looking for a tighter fiscal control of our budget, that beyond these numbers, that burden, the taxpayers are going to directly feel that burden and are going to put us into an override situation this year. That's the long and the short of it.
And to just take it a step further, what we do this year may not require an override. The results of the cumulative budget may and probably will require an override in the future. But we have to address the numbers that are before us now. And we do have to project out and get a fuller financially. And that's really not, I don't know that that's the role of this committee. The role of this committee was to look at our numbers and determine whether we needed an override. And unstated but implied this year. Looking forward, I think we can all recognize if we're going to build a capital plan, we're going to properly fund education. Unless we get some really generous donors, we're going to be looking at an override, if not FY22, certainly FY23. But right now, we're looking at FY21.
And if I remember correctly, these numbers were recommended by Mr. Madden, but they actually took into account our revenue growth. So understanding that the school budget at 5% is a large portion of the town's budget, it still puts us in that
We still have to maintain
whatever
that
it was, that
total
3%
control.
total
Yes.
revenue. I don't remember off the top of my head, it was like 3 point something. So this kind of gets us to that mix of, on a normal given year, if you follow these policies, you're in line with our annual growth.
With the revenue growth, yeah.
And that's where I think we've seen us getting in trouble, that we have not had we're playing a catch-up game, we're going above and beyond, we're spending a little too much here.
We're using free cash to put something in operations, which then is a double hit the next year, right, in terms of
And
budget
so,
growth, so.
let's vote on that, then we'll get right to free cash.
Well, we vote on,
A recommendation of 2.5, so I'll read it.
It's to accept as written, right?
To accept as recommended, town operations up to but not to exceed a 2.5 overall budget increase. Education up to and not to exceed a 5% assessment increase. We have a motion and a
I
second.
made the motion.
Yeah, we already did that part.
yeah, I think we had it already, but I'll second his motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous, okay. Going to what Chris just said, free cash. If you look in the packet I handed out, there's basically just a DLS description of free cash. As a financial policy, we should refrain from using free cash to fund ongoing expenditures. With accepting Mr. Madden's recommendations, he did present a budget that did not use any free cash and felt like now free cash could serve as the foundation for the town's capital program.
Do
So,
we already have that in our
Yeah, we do.
policies?
We do. Our policy says that free cash should not be used for any non-reoccurring expenditure, any reoccurring expenditures. And I think we have something about using capital, but we have to ensure that we're not funding recurring expenditures. And we can tighten that up, but right now we're saying free cash is not to be used to fund budgets.
right.
And that's practice.
All right, motion?
Second.
All in favor? Unanimous. Capital projects and spending. So, as a review, the town contacted the Collins Center. The Collins report was sent out to all members of the committee to basically develop a capital plan for the town of Whitman. One thing that needs to be clarified about this plan is that although it would be the best way to follow it from start to finish, it's not a static document. It's going to have some ebb and flow based on needs, funding abilities. We may have already seen some changes in that tonight with some of the things we've talked about. So it's a roadmap with a couple. You'd like to follow it. It has a direct way to get to where we want to be, but it may not always be the most direct route. It consists of some general fund projects with excluded debt, and it is primarily based on either raise and appropriate or free cash funds. One of the projects of note is the construction of the new DPW facility. Now, this would more likely need to be done with some type of debt, whether it be a dedicated source inside or outside of the levy. But we currently, Frank, do you want to discuss this, where we
Sure.
currently sit on this project?
We've been looking at this. It's probably the oldest item on the agenda right now. We started in 2007. It's 12 years ago. We've gone through a couple of iterations on what kind of building we could build and what's affordable. We had a town meeting that voted to support a $9 million DPW building, and it crashed and burned at the ballot box. We've since looked at a couple of different options. Our building commissioner is of the opinion that we should probably be looking at a steel building, a pre-constructed type building. And he may be right. They make some pretty good steel buildings today. But the feasibility we looked at is 12 years old, and it's probably not a good idea to move forward with that set of circumstances. The the Budget and Capital Expenditures Committee voted to support moving forward with the DPW building, but I think we have to get a better handle on what that's going to cost. And that may mean that we go to town meeting in May with a request to fund feasibility and design. We're going to collect the information we need beforehand. In fact, we have a meeting Friday morning, I think, with a company that does these steel buildings and has done some in the area to get a better understanding of what's involved in it. We've done some preliminary work. We do know that the site that we're looking at will require injected, that's the word I'm looking for, footings. And we have to go 18 to 20 feet deep to do that. So that's a little bit of work.
But we knew that 12 years ago, though, right? That was part of the
No,
original.
we actually didn't. We knew that about 4 years ago.
But still, it was part of the plan that.
But it's part of the analysis that we did. We did in 2 years, well, 2 years ago, I think it was. We actually hired somebody to go out and do core samples and all over the place to determine the best location for the building, which is where that green building in the front is right now.
So it's in the exact spot of where there's already a building?
Yeah, we're gonna tear that down. That building's 109 years old, and the second
need
floor
temporary-
has the working fire damage that, let's not go in there. The building's gone. It needs to be demolished. And that's where we would place the new structure, and we would look to reskin the garage behind it, and that would become a cold storage building, parking vehicles that aren't used during certain times and equipment. And the front building would become an operations center. It would have sewer and water areas for work, employee work areas, mechanics bay and truck wash stuff.
So how much are you gonna go and ask for this study, to redo this study?
I hope to have an answer for that in the next 2 weeks.
So the Collins report recommends that we spend so much on that building.
Based on
Fiscal
what
21.
we've accumulated in information.
So
But it may not be valid.
it sounds like that what you're actually going to go for is probably going to be significantly less than what the Collins report is recommending, because
No.
the Collins report was thinking we were going to start funding the building, where actually now we're going to
Can't fund something you don't have
And we're
plans
funding
for.
it.
exactly, we're gonna kind of redo a plan that's already kind of, or do an alternate plan,
Well,
trying to use whatever we have.
It's not that simple,
We
though.
actually don't have a plan,
Yeah.
and it's going to be very difficult to go to town meeting to vote a capital
Right.
expenditure to build a DPW and say, trust me, we'll get a plan.
This is the top-ranked project in the Collins matrix as they
Right.
presented it, but they recommend funding it with a 20-year bond. So it's not like we're going to have an excess $4 million this year
Right.
toward capital.
So, but in that matrix, there was a certain amount of that for this year that sounds like is gonna get, as you said, it's a working document, might get pushed out later in the matrix as we go for funding for a plan for it.
I would
instead.
guess it would be pushed out 1 year, and this year the incurred expense would be the design and feasibility.
Probably somewhere around
Right.
$300,000-$400,000.
You're thinking a little higher, but yeah.
I mean, it's like probably gonna be 8% of whatever you think your
Yep.
square foot costs are gonna be.
Is that something that this board needs to make a recommendation on, or?
You gonna put a new committee together for it? I know, I hate saying it, but
Well, I would just say
I think the
maybe,
group we have now can do that.
Yeah,
you have a DPW committee still?
building
We
facilities
have
and
the
capital
DPW
expenditure.
on the, yeah.
God bless them.
I would say that this, I would entertain a motion that whether or not the committee would support an article being placed on for evaluation needs and architectural plans. Something along that line, where we just support based on,
Well, is the recommendation that we support a particular project, or is the motion to adopt the report and structure put in or recommended by the Collins Center to follow the recommendations?
And the first step in that implementation would be feasibility and design.
Yeah.
What it means is it won't happen in fiscal '21
Right.
well, the reason.
unless we do it in the fall.
The reason why I brought this one up this is a major project that's going to involve debt, and it's something that I think this board should weigh in whether or not we see that the importance of it to, down the road, add on to this debt. So
I think I guess, yeah, I mean, conceptually, if this board is voting on anything, it would either be to
recommend moving forward with the project.
bring the Collins report and mix it into our, the rest of our report and say, yeah, I think we do have to start funding,
And this will result in some form of debt article
yeah.
that would likely be an exclusion.
Right.
I can't see
For
that any.
the whole article, or just for?
No,
just
for the construction, the design and construct. We have to put up some money to do our feasibility. I don't think we should do that on debt. I think we should utilize available funds for that. But that will give us the ability to identify what we need to borrow to move forward with the project.
So if you're not doing the design and you just need money for your feasibility study, you're probably somewhere in the $100,000 area. You're not gonna get into any big money until you
You
get
say
into the.
1,000?
100,000.
Thank you.
I'll do it for 1,000.
Right.
It is my feasibility study.
We'll know
Don't
that-
do it.
We'll know that shortly, but the chances are that we're going to need some form of design, even if it's a steel building.
It's gonna be, if you're just looking at feasibility for it, you're gonna go through your designer selection, you're gonna bring somebody on, all you're gonna do is review the study you did, and then you have to downsize it.
Yeah.
Then he's gonna give you a number on whatever you come up with. If you say you want 20,000 square feet, and the average price is in that $300, $400 a square foot, that's where he's gonna base his building cost on, and you're gonna end up paying 8% of that for your design and construction and bidding.
Well, that's what I'm saying,
that's-
the potential for these prefab buildings is, there isn't a lot of design.
No, there isn't, and actually, I've done a couple of them, and it is a slightly different way that you go through the procurement for.
Well, now we know who to tap.
I was gonna say, I think we know who should be on that committee.
Oh, no, that committee's already set.
I think there's 2 vacancies.
No vacancy for me, but I'll be happy to help you. Call me anytime.
Okay.
But at the top of the capital plan laid out is this project, right?
Right. But remember, the capital plan is an evolving
Yep.
project, as long as we stick to the concept of working with those priorities and numbers.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of the best
Motion.
motion to make from a
Motion that we
recommendation.
support the capital plan.
Support the Collins report, Captain?
Yeah, I'm sorry, like the Collins Center, I think the motion that we support that moving forward, and
Do you want to support that as a whole?
we understand that it's a fluid document, but
Yeah, I mean, there could be parts of that Collins,
Yeah, I would,
That we just, that's
for this
decided, you know.
particular,
That's true.
I think we should try to pare it down to this particular project, since that's what we're really discussing here. Because there's another project on the next page that we want to discuss too, so if
We don't have it here in front of us, but the Collins report basically set parameters that develop the matrix
you gotta have.
in which puts the DPW, which prior to the middle school, put the DPW number one. So we could vote on recommending the matrix used by the Collins report to prioritize projects.
So that's actually where I'd like to jump in here. The matrix used by the Collins report included some things that would be in conflict with how we've already voted recommendations in this meeting. The ambulance fund, the motor vehicle fine account, bump projects up because they have existing funding.
I don't think, to be quite honest, I don't see why we have to vote the Collins report at all from this committee. I think we just take our own findings. We could support this separately if we want, but I don't even think it's a charge of this committee. This is something that, you know, the finance committee again and the selectmen again, it's going to be
Capital
in
improvement
the
committee,
capital
right?
improvement. It's all going to be recommendations from other committees. I think we're getting what I was afraid we would do all along is a little bit of
Overlapping.
scope creep here, and we're going beyond what we should be doing.
I think it is worth saying that the core recommendation of the Collins Center is to reserve between 3.9 and 4.5 or 5% of net revenue every year for capital projects. And however we choose to do that is what they think we need to sustain the capital needs of the town.
And what will identify that for us is as we look at next year's budget planning, we're going to find that in order to do that, we're going to need a
John's
levy
almost
increase.
done with that budget.
Is there any discussion around funding, available funds for the feasibility for the DPW? Is that
Well, I don't think we know what that
discussion
is.
about how we're
I
funding?
don't think we know what that is
We're
until
going
he
to
has
find
that
out a
meeting.
number, but I believe we have the money available to do that feasibility study. We
I know
choose
with
to
the
expend
middle
it.
school, it's here to discuss
Well,
how it's
Yeah,
going
that's
to be
the net.
funded. So is that different for the DPW
I think it will
project?
be. And I think it will be because of the ultimate, well, we're jumping ahead, but it's brought up, why don't we?
But again, I think and I think it's certainly worthwhile, since we're all in the room, to talk about both of these projects. But this committee, I don't know how it fits into the role of this committee, other than to say, yeah, it is important
Right.
that we follow these recommendations and this stuff gets done. But unless,
The capital.
Well,
I think similar
it
to
is
the.
it is capital, but
we're not a capital committee.
But similar to the recommendations made on the caps on the operations budgets, I think this committee should be recommending to the Board of Selectmen that they adopt or look to adopt, it may need to be phased in, kind of the core tenets of the recommendation, which are that you set aside a certain percentage of your revenues for capital expenditures. We already voted to stay away from using free cash for recurring costs.
Again, I believe that's in our fiscal policies that are existing, believe it or not. But those are
But
relatively
actually-
new policies.
Actually, Chris, that brings up a point that our role here is looking at those things that will require us to consider an override. I think that's really what it comes down to.
And that's what I was
And
going to
this
say.
will require,
Dedicating
In the near
4%
future.
of net budget
Yep.
will require an override.
And these two projects specifically were put on for discussion because even seeking funding to get to the first phase of the DPW building may require some type of exclusion. And we may find that out Friday, Frank, that
Right.
this gentleman could say to you, you need $400,000 for this first phase. At that point, we may need to go beyond a debt capital exclusion, something like that. And that's why I put these two projects on, because there is that, it could present itself that these next projects go outside of a free cash situation.
right, because both of these are going to require voters to take affirmative action in the ballot box.
So before we jump,
That's where the challenge is going.
before we jump too far ahead, could we, I would like to see I would entertain a motion that supports, how could we word this?
Further funding for the
Support
review of
funding
the
for
study?
feasibility.
For the feasibility study?
Yeah.
Yes. Motion for, if the Budget Override Evaluation Committee supports seeking funding
For review
review.
and requirement of the feasibility study for the DPW facility.
I second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
Unanimous. Good. All right, moving on.
Now, I think it's a different issue in some ways when we get to the middle school. And let me just throw out these thoughts. If we decide to build a DPW, we have a pretty good sense that we're probably going to be capped out around 4 million. It's a number that we've heard a couple of times. The middle school is a whole different ballgame. Whether it's a renovation or a new building, it's going to require a significantly greater amount of money, and we're talking in tens of millions of dollars, and probably north of 50. We're going to seek support from the MSBA, but we're still going to be looking at bonding what for the town is going to be a first ever number. And my guess, based on what we've seen around us, is we're going to probably be on the hook for somewhere around $38 to $40 million to accomplish this building project.
That's
That-
you think that's our hook?
Yeah, that's our
Piece.
That's our portion.
Our piece.
That's going to be a really striking number for people. And it starts with a feasibility study, which will include a design for whatever the ultimate recommendation is. I don't know if 750 is enough.
I'm looking at, they range from 450 to 1.1 million. Depends on what you're looking at.
Right.
Company that you go to.
So if,
You cap it at that. When you put it out
Yeah.
for your design to selection, you're just gonna
So-
have to cap it.
when we present this to the town, we have to present in two phases. The first phase is feasibility/design. The second phase is building it. Unless we have voter support, and I'm not talking town meeting now, I'm talking a core group of people that turn out at the ballot box, we're not going to get anywhere with this. So I think it's important when we put this out to town meeting in May, that we take whatever measures are necessary to ensure that we have support beyond the vote of town meeting. And that would mean either a one-time capital exclusion or perhaps a 3-year debt exclusion to bond that money, go to the ballot, and we could be doing this in May. And ensure that we have support to move forward. I'm just throwing that out for discussion purposes.
Frank, I know there are issues with the building. And as part of that feasibility study, would we get both a cost to renovate and a cost to
Yes.
tear down and build?
Yes.
which we may find the renovation is just as expensive as starting over. I mean,
I can
may say there's no
assure
renovation.
you that they will not renovate that building.
Right. Well,
At the end of the day, after seeing,
the same thing just happened in Rockland, right? It was more money to renovate the elementary schools than it was to build a brand new building that housed all of their elementary
you
schools.
still have a 50-year-old building at the end of the day.
Yeah, so but that's a question that people are going to ask, and
Oh,
people
yeah.
who aren't paying attention to what's going on in towns around us, right, are going to ask. But at some point, we're going to do the codes, do you're either looking at a big renovation Band-Aid that the state's not going to chip money in for, or you're looking at, right, building a new building. So I'm behind it. I'm a little bit hesitant to use this as a litmus test for public support, but I understand it, and I understand the reason for it. So again, I'm hesitant. I'm not opposed. I'd like to hear other people's thoughts.
Well,
If you don't, let me just jump in real quick, John. I think it's also very important for people to understand that even being accepted into this phase by MSBA speaks volumes of the condition of the middle school. And just the amount of work that project actually needs. I'm sure Jeff would be able to tell me a little bit more about how many school districts and
61 applications for this year.
And they chose
They selected
11?
11.
Yeah.
And we were the first, at the acceptance in Boston, with the treasurer, with the state treasurer, we were the only school that it was their first time through. So Hingham had gone through, they appropriated their feasibility in FY18, they were just accepted now. So this was their third time through. So either the building is that bad or we really draw a good number and they just liked us, you know? But I think it goes to the fact that we documented, Ernie mentioned this before, he documents everything and we have data to support that the building needs some things. And it's not unsafe, but it's not the building it should be for our kids.
And I'll get right to you, John, but I would just like to see us, hate to see us get into a situation similar to what happened
Yes.
that's what I was just going to
in
say. Is
Hanson
that
where, and this is why I said,
Town of Hanson wasted $500,000.
Right.
And then the town voted it down.
votes it down.
But if this vote for the feasibility does not pass, what happens then?
We go back to the drawing board with MSBA. We go in the queue.
And I think if
And we
it-
stay in a building that they've just told us needs to be renovated.
And you may not have the answer to the questions that you want to be able to answer for the public, right? I mean, that's the catch-22 here, right? If you don't fund it, you may not get the answers around renovations and costs, and so it's a little bit of the chicken and egg. What comes first? That's my hesitancy, right?
I think
That is what comes first, is the feasibility. They have,
Right.
this is,
But how do you make a case to people that they should vote a debt exclusion for something that we really don't have the answer to the questions to yet, right? And that's my concern.
The debt exclusion they're voting for is only for the $750,000 or whatever
Correct.
number we come up with. So that's only for the phase one is the vote to get those answers, you know, and I agree, it's tough, but now if we fund it out of free cash or somewhere else, and then we find out 2 years from now that they're not gonna vote
There's
for
no support for it.
there's no support for it, then, I mean, this is exactly what
we can
happened to
have skin in
Hanson.
the game, is what
You know,
you're saying.
and I think we can use the Hanson story to say, hey, this is what happens if we don't do this. If we don't move forward and get this 750, then, and the school doesn't get planned and getting going, and then McQuon falls down and everybody moves out, and now they're all stuck in Indian Head, and they're still basically have a similar problem. It's just 20 years newer maybe, or a little bit. They still don't have a new school or a remodeled school.
we don't even have an Indian Head for students
I
to
mean-
move into. So.
Well, that's what we
I
have to
don't-
try and get across, and I don't know how
Yeah.
we do it, but that's the point we have to try to make, is we don't really have a choice, we have to do that.
Right, we don't have a choice, we have to do it, right?
learned from all of
So
Hanson's
so let's just assume there's $750,000 on the budget to fund some type of study,
is
capital
there
projects. I don't
$750,000?
know.
In free cash. What's in free cash?
We don't have $750,000 just lying around, do we? We pull it out of free cash and
I don't think we have any money just laying around.
so,
Did we-
But, right, there's a give and a take with any projects, and I guess my question would be, because this is the way I look at, if this is this dire, if it's this important to get in with MSBA, then what other projects are we gonna fund from free cash that we're putting this on the ballot for? As opposed to fund this because, you know, hey, Board of Selectmen, as elected officials, Finance Committee as appointed officials, you need to be able to make a decision about which buildings and which capital projects are the most important, and about what, and whether we have public support for or not today. The risk is MSBA goes away and we lose 40 cents on the dollar, right? So do we really want to take that chance by putting this one out for a debt exclusion as opposed to the $100,000 from the DPW or a couple $100,000 for something else and wrapping those into a debt exclusion that you could make a case to the town that, hey, maybe they're not as imminent, maybe they're not as important. I don't know the answer to that. That's why I'm having a hard time with this recommendation, right? I
think that's why it's on here, so.
what other options do we have?
So I have the Collins report open in front of me right now. This is their second highest ranked project, is the feasibility study for the middle school, and it's $750,000. They planned it with a 5-year debt funded within the levy, as all of their projects are within the levy.
And that was drafted prior to
It was prior to
being
getting
invited into eligibility.
exactly
But that plan also included us having $1.1 million.
Right, it didn't take into account the fact that
$3 million available in
dedicated
the levy.
specifically for this, for
pay for that.
capital projects. Yeah.
right,
If you,
we're not there yet.
It also,
that's for another year.
for the sake of saying, it also estimated
You know,
262,000 for
There's
Duval
another
roof.
interesting piece on this, and Chris, you eloquent in how you argue that.
He's always so eloquent, isn't he?
The
Except when he gets fired up.
potential to present multiple projects on a 3-year exclusion might have some merit.
2 feasibility studies, you mean?
So wrap this up with the DPW.
Does that help us get additional funds, start working towards that? And I know it's not 3 or 4%, but it's something that's now available within the budget to start to meet that percentage that we want to grow to as available for capital.
But then we're really rolling the dice.
Yeah, we are, because then we're
We
rolling
may
the
end up
dice.
with nothing, except
on
a
the
bunch of free
DPW
cash
building, too.
that we can't use.
I'm going to answer my own question. It was said earlier in the meeting, there's 1.9 million in free cash. This feasibility project, as my understanding, it's the definition of a capital expense, one time, not recurring.
But you
This
don't have
week- this-
1.9, because you're losing 500 out of it.
No, there's 1.9 there now.
Yeah, we know
We're
this.
just not putting an
building is
additional
needed.
500,000 in it now. There's 1.9 in it now.
We just discussed probably an hour ago, not replacing the roof on Duval School. So if we don't fund this feasibility study right out of free cash, we're saying again,
It's going into capital stabilization and stabilization. What we don't use this year in free cash will be going into the
but
funds that will
excuse me.
enable us.
what I'm saying, if we as a town, and setting the tone from the top as Board of Selectmen, and our recommendation is going to them, if we're saying we're gonna leave it up to you guys to decide in the town whether this building's important, I think we know this building's important. I think it's our duty to.
I guess what makes that hard is what other capital articles are gonna come on, are gonna be presented to town meeting aside from all these ones that we're talking about.
Well, these are 1 and 2 on
Well,
the
we better not
list,
be
right?
seeing anything new that isn't on that list.
Right.
But I mean, what is the estimate of capital articles that are gonna come forth to town meeting? I mean, do we have a number in mind of how much I mean,
We know that we can't take on, I don't think we can take on, any capital project that involves borrowing without the certainty that we have provided in our levy limit the ability to service that debt.
Right.
Otherwise, we're back where we were 2 years ago. So those capital projects that are one-time and fit within the boundaries of what we are willing to commit, and I think earlier this fall, when we talked about it, I suggested that somewhere between 900 and $1 million of that free cash be transferred to the capital stabilization account to build our base for the future. And the need to move forward in year 2 with debt is dependent on our ability to get people to understand that, yes, we do need to increase that levy to provide for capital.
so last year we had, out of the, let's call this ambulance receipts, that we're now saying is general fund, we had $85,000 for radio equipment, protective equipment 42, 70,000 for a payment for a pump engine, which I'm assuming we're gonna have that payment again.
2 more years.
Yeah, 2 years. So there's 120,000 now that are in the general fund. And then when we voted the debt exclusion, we had 130,000 for a dump truck. We had 48,000. So my question is, all of that stuff was within the levy limit after we voted the debt exclusion. So we've got 400,000 or 500,000 right there. We have to, that goes back to my conversation. If we figure out how much money we think we have in revenue, we subtract out what we need for Article 2, that has what's left within the levy limit for capital expenses. And until we do that, we don't know how much money we really have to spend for capital within the levy.
But none of what you defined there was really in the levy limit except the,
Well, everything I did there was funded by a source that's now inside the levy limit, because 4 of them were ambulance receipts, and then the other ones came at the second town meeting, which was only have been funded by the money that became available from the debt exclusion.
except we did use free cash in that because we reclassified the free cash.
Yeah, well, we used, I mean, there's like I said, we had 800,000, $1 million. I mean, I think we are going to use free cash. I think we need to continue to use free cash, but use it for capital instead of.
I agree, but we can't, we have to be sure that when we commit to debt, which is a long-term process, that we have the revenue to support that, because free cash can dry up. And if we commit to those expenditures without a source of revenue for it,
You need a building for the school.
we do what we did when we voted the
Right, we do what we
police
do with the
station.
police station.
So, I
We
mean,
said we would use free cash to pay for it, and we were fine for the first 4 years. Then we hit a hiccup, and we only had 600,000 in free cash, and we had a $900,000 payment. We
so
wound up using capital stabilization to make up the difference.
fiscal
I don't want to put us in that
responsibility,
position again.
I support Dawn in what she's saying, to use the free cash for the 750,000 for that, and also possibly even another for the DPW building, only because, like you said, I mean, as much as I'd like to get this, see the support of the vote, I think the free cash is better off used in something like that.
Well, and then that would put any additional capital projects more than likely into some type of debt exclusion, right? If we
Not
decided.
necessarily a debt exclusion, depends on where we're at.
Correct.
We could
Maybe
fit in-
reprioritized, we
I
may have
mean,
to wait a
the
year.
objective of the Collins report is to get 1.3 million or 4% or whatever funded within the levy. So if we can work our way towards that, the problem that I have still is we spend the money and then 2 years down the road, they vote not to go to phase 2, and we
But
throw,
we really have no choice. We have to find out. And the scary part is, like Don said, I mean, what if we do spend the money and they tell us exactly what I think we already know?
that could help us. That could help our cause down the, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is, right, if you put it out there for a vote today, you still have to make that case, and you're making it's a weaker case because you don't have the numbers, you don't truly understand. I mean, that's what the purpose of the study is.
I agree.
Well, of course, in that case, we have to make the case to town meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're going to have to vote to spend it.
It would be difficult to
Spend it out
ask.
of free
And the
cash.
challenge with these projects is you can get a project through town meeting that ultimately requires a election vote. Getting the election vote is a different story. We had all kinds of indication of support for a new DPW building. I mean, what were there, 6 no votes in the 300 people that turned out? I think it was 294 to 6. It was an astounding number. And then we lost 2-1 at the ballot box.
We did 3 years in a row at the police and fire station in Duxbury. Wasn't until the 4th year that we actually got it through the ballot.
I think
This
the
would be
surprise
third
is
year.
that we didn't expect it to pass through MSBA first time around. So that's a surprise. So I'd say it kind of puts a wrinkle in this notion of.
Pushes it.
Screwed up our timetable.
It
did.
pushes
It
it
did.
to the head of the class.
So maybe to, reference back my earlier conversation about the statutory method and the school assessment this year, we know we're getting, a reduction there. So is that the opportunity? It frees up a little more money in the operating budget. Maybe that gets moved to free cash, which in turn gets funding this out of free cash.
Hasn't been proven yet, though. We're still
No,
working on that, I
I'm
think.
speaking off the
And
cuff
ultimately,
here,
again, I
but
mean, we're only going to make
There's
some
another story.
recommendations.
We're making a
But
recommendation.
there's going to be some higher committees that are going to have to figure this one out.
I think what we're talking about is what's our preference given the policies that we've looked at and we believe the town should adopt, right? So we've got a situation where the Collins Center and Mr. Madden have basically said these one-time expenditures, these are what you want to use free cash for. To me, I think to what John said, to what Don said, the DPW, if the money's there in free cash, that to me is my priority, given the information I have today. Now,
So given what we know, because we don't know
right,
what
given
else is on the list.
all of a sudden, somebody comes up with something,
On it.
right? Like someone brings something to the finance committee during the budgeting process that
Well, what if snow next month in February
Right.
ruins the Duval roof again?
I think, in my opinion, is you go in saying this is the appropriate use of free cash, assuming that it's there.
Falls within the guidelines and recommendations of this committee.
Correct.
It was 5 feet of snow and an ice storm that did that in.
We have between now
The day
and
after the Super Bowl. It was a
We're
bad.
through
April for
February.
right when we set the warrant for a lot of things to happen, and I think we're also recommending that we move forward with both of these. So if that then means there are changes to the fiscal situation that require they're funded through a debt exclusion, then that's fine. I think we would all say that's what we should do, but given the information we have today, my recommendation would be these are the things that fall within the policies that we're adopting.
I don't know that we can
recommend.
include the DPW in any vote now, because we don't know how much money that
Right.
is.
Great.
No, but again, I mean, conceptually wise, I think we can. I think what we're saying here.
Didn't we just
Is
take a
that-
vote on the DP?
What if that ends up coming in at 600,000? DPW, we don't think
All
it
of these things
will.
are subject to change, right?
Ultimately, we're not the deciding vote.
We're just saying,
It's a
one-time expenditures.
They
fall
want
under this
$6 million
capital
for
idea.
steel building, I'm going to say forget it.
I mean, I would have a question for Jet. Do you know, have you heard how other towns have funded these feasibility studies? Is it predominantly free cash? Is it?
I can look,
yeah.
I just know it goes, in some communities, it goes to vote. I mean, you vote on, is it a debt exclusion, is it a free cash piece? I can look as we go forward, I have
Well,
not.
any way you look at it, it's gotta go to vote, right? We
Got to
have
go to vote.
Right.
Well, not if, we-
Appropriate the money.
well, if it goes, if we do it
No, I'm
from free
talking
cash,
town
it
meeting
just
vote.
goes, if we go to free cash, it just goes to town meeting.
Well, that's a vote.
I understand that, but town
Doesn't
meeting.
make it any easier
town
to make
meeting,
it
free
happen.
cash, it's gonna get passed. I mean, who?
Yeah,
Who,
okay.
it's not costing me any money in my pocketbook.
Well, it depends on who shows up.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, I mean, it's not costing.
I wouldn't exactly say, there are a lot of things I agree with you on at town meeting that, yes, it's not costing any more money, we vote for it. But this could be something where a significant amount of other projects are put off because of the amount of money. So it may cause some turmoil that,
And if that does, then the capital committee and the finance committee have some decisions to make. But, you know, I agree.
I think this is where adopting the policy of this is a one-time, this is a one-time expense. If it's available in a single year via free cash, that's what's appropriate to use that money for.
think it
So,
fits in.
so I guess my motion would be,
if you look a page back, Chris, you're right. You're 100% right, that we talked about free cash.
Let him make his motion, go ahead.
yeah, so, you know, my motion would be pursuant to the middle school proposal to fund $750,000 for the feasibility study, that our recommendation is following the Collins Center's recommendation for the use of free cash, that we recommend that the 750 be taken from free cash if available
So
in fiscal year 20.
you're using less words, you're moving
Yes,
to
please. Thank you.
use 700, you're moving to recommend 750,000 feasibility study be funded through free cash.
Right. What about the Collins Center report?
I think we want to say, I think we want to make it a point
No one's
that
gonna
that
read that.
is-
It's only gonna be in
Yeah,
our
I know,
minutes.
I know.
I think it's
Support the
basically,
decision.
it's based upon the recommendations that we've been voting on.
Right.
It's also, it also is Madden's recommendation to use free cash that way too, so.
I'll second the paraphrase version.
What he said.
It works for me. The paraphrase works for me.
All right, Frank, you have that?
Whatever you got. it's
You
got
said the paraphrase works, yeah. That's
Motion
the
to
motion.
recommend feasibility study through free cash, 750,000.
Scott seconded it.
I did.
I just to drag this out even further, I'm just not convinced that we should be recommending a funding source. I think that should be decided at another time.
Well, it's gonna end up getting, I think, again, we're just recommending to stick with our policy that we've already recommended, but I think at the end of the day, your committee, the finance committee, capital committee, the selectmen are gonna have to decide how this ends up on a ballot or on a warrant or, go ahead, Tim.
I have to agree with Dave, because I don't have the capital plan in front of me, so I don't know what spending 750 from free cash, what else is out there for capital projects that I can in good conscience say,
But you're gonna be discussing that with the finance committee, and you're gonna be discussing it with
No,
the
that's what I
capital
mean.
committee
So-
and the selectmen.
so if we just said that we support the expenditure of the $750,000, it's gonna give the selectmen and the finance committee and the capital committee time to look. It's giving them direction. We want you to spend the money. You figure out where it's gonna come from.
Well, I think I hear what you're saying, but I think what I'm saying is $750,000 is a big number.
Right.
But it also fits the definition of the recommendations that this committee has, through previous votes, right, and discussions, support. And that's why I think it's kind of appropriate to say, hey, this is one that should come from free cash if the money's there. If there's something else that, for other reasons, bumps to the top of the list, certainly, you know, finance committee can make a decision to say we're gonna take something else. Or if there's something behind it, I guess the thought process, at least for me, behind that motion is, if there's something behind it and it remains behind it on the list, then that's what we should be looking for a different source of funding from, because this fits the definition of the policy that's there.
And I would say, to counter Dave's, if all of a sudden we were talking and a motion was made to a debt exclusion or one-time capital exclusion, then it fits into the definition of this committee.
Correct.
Unfortunately, now we've said free cash, and, well, that'll be ultimately decided by another one.
Not really an
So-
override evaluation if it's free cash.
What's that?
It's not really an override evaluation if it's free cash.
Right, the other two of the choices, and that's why, for me, it was kind of important to discuss it here.
I think the discussion brought out a lot of
Good points. And to your point, you don't necessarily need to vote with Dave either.
This is the first time in 3 years we've agreed on something.
Right. You don't need to just go along, Tim.
Just keep balloons and streamers right now.
All right, so we have a motion and a second on paraphrasing of Mr. George. I believe Frank has that down. So, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Nay votes?
Abstain? Nay?
Abstentions?
I'm staying right now. Come on over here.
Wow, two things. Sorry about that.
All right, friendships happen in the
Here's
weirdest places. All right, so that was 2 abstentions, Frank.
Got it.
Just
I'll
vote
get you
no.
guys a sampler.
Santa Claus.
Considering it's 8 o'clock, but I do have a spot here for general recommendations. And so what is on people's mind that we feel within the next couple of meetings, selectmen or meeting needs to be?
Yeah, I guess, I don't know if it's worth making the statement or not, or whether it requires a recommendation from this committee, but I think, I hear about we need to get to a point of 4% for a capital plan. That's gonna probably lead to an override situation. I think to restore programs in certain departments, that's going to be an override situation. I think from my standpoint, as a committee, I'd like to recommend that, any override that's considered incorporates all of those departments, and that our recommendation to the board would be to do it one time, so that we don't get in a situation where, someone's going for a capital override in year 1 and programs for another department in year 2 or 3. I think as part of the financial discipline to get to a point where we can recognize those 2.5% and 5% growth numbers, we've got to do it one time, and it's all got to be kind of part of one package plan. I don't know what that number is. I don't know, if there's something in the fire department or the police department. I know Jeff, has lost programs that really probably should be restored. I'd like to make sure that happens. Yes, the seniors, right? I know there are items out there. I'd like to make sure that happens all together.
I think they've all done a pretty good job bringing us in some budgets that show restoration on what they want, so.
But some departments
whether it
may
can
be
happen this year and not.
Yeah, some
is
departments
no,
might be
but-
a year or 2 ahead of other departments,
Yeah.
right? And I really think, at least my recommendation would be that we give those departments a time frame to come up with those numbers, and we bring them all together as one.
So you kind of
Paraphrase.
you kind of did a little segue into where I was going to go with this next.
I didn't read ahead, I promise.
You just set him up.
I completely agree.
perfectly.
So I'm going to go
Give him that real soft serve.
You did. You threw me the law ball there perfectly. What I will say is I took, when the school and committee and Jeff presented its budget, I took that budget and I did go back sent it back to Mr. Madden, and I'm still waiting on him to finalize this, but I said, John, taking this budget, if we were to get to every piece in this budget, brings the budget up to X. If the town adopted we should be at a 5% assessment, can you kind of chart out what we would need in a 5-year override to get us where 5%, now within our operating growth, sustains us? I'm still waiting on that number, but I did toss that out to him, and I think that is a big piece of where we are 5 years from now. The strategic plan, going back to, I think is a major missing piece of all of this. We have a survey that clearly says we will fund. What? You're shaking your head, John.
That's all right. I'm staying out of it.
It says we will support some sort of
some sort of
that's what
override.
we have to
Says we will
quantify now.
support debt exclusion spending for some sort of project. We've done a lot of work with the consultant of where we need to be, policies. It needs to be put together. What we're lacking is a full diagram of where departments plan to be in 5 years. And are we going to do it once? Are we going to go for one override? We're missing that. And I think it's a key piece. It is if you look at, any reading clearly says that a critically recommended best practice, and I wish he was still.
I was gonna say.
I wish he was still
He's
sitting in the
issue
back
right
room.
now.
Is a
John.
strategic plan. I would like to see it done. I would like to see this committee recommend that be a critical piece.
That is a critical piece of coming up with a budget override plan.
Yes.
Is there consulting services, I mean, do we have an
Well, there's-
idea of what a consulting
there's
service would
lots of
cost?
them.
No, I'm saying, do we have an idea of what that might cost?
We will before the warrant's created.
Have you seen it?
Yeah, I've seen different strategic
guys
plans
use
go
the
together. Depends on what you want. I mean, I've got some people I can ask.
It wasn't too bad.
I personally, I don't think it would be a lot of money. I mean, a lot of the groundwork's there. Numbers are there. Surveys have been done. So it's really bringing the pieces together and bringing the right people together, which is
Come on, throw it out. Guess.
20 grand maybe,
20, okay.
25 grand. I can't imagine it being much more than that.
I agree. But our role here is to just recommend the plan, not the cost.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's something that I think, despite the cost, it's something that it really wraps up everything that everybody's been working for, whether it's the school committee with the Mars report, with our Collins report, with the John Madden report, with the work of this committee, and then the survey that was done, that you need something to put it all together.
You need a roadmap, right? And I mean, we need a roadmap of how to get there, and we could all throw out, override numbers and years we should do the override and when we think it'll pass or not pass, but I think a strategic plan, certainly I would expect that roadmap to be part of this. How do you get to 4%? Can you do it within the budget,
Or do we?
slicing
What's
off
the
little?
plan?
You can, right? You get to 4%. It might take you 20 years, or 25 years, right? And then in the meantime, all the buildings fall down, or how do you get there?
Terrible thought.
Well, I
Make the
do.
motion that we recommend to the Board of Selectmen that they consider a strategic plan for town meeting warrant.
Consider engaging.
Consultant first.
Consultant.
For a strategic plan.
I'll second that.
Dave, do you agree?
I do today.
A trifecta.
I think I just saw a pig go by.
Okay, do we have a second?
I second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. All right, so that reaches the end of, kind of glad I put this together.
I think a lot of stuff got discussed here, and I'm actually wondering, well, I guess I'll make the motion. I mean, are we ready to consider a yes or no vote on an override for fiscal '21?
A recommendation for one?
A recommendation on an override. I mean, that's why we're here. We got all of this stuff we just talked about.
Do we want to fill in the blanks first?
I don't know.
I think we need to hear the final report from John Madden with what you sent him.
I mean, only, like I said, there's some numbers that
All
we
his
still need.
recommendations.
The school committee numbers.
No, I was talking with school, to get a rough number, because I think that's going to be a big number. And there is an obvious need for corrections and bringing back programs. That number's so big that it could end up so big that I don't know how we implement that correctly. That needs to me, be something that, okay, here's what the number's going to be.
I think you also can take that plan, if that roadmap, and share it with our partner town.
Yes.
When you're talking about that large number, I think that's really important. Now, I want to be careful. There's a part of me that says, you know, you can also take a hard approach, right? And the school committee has it within their power to not relent on a number and go to a super town meeting and all of that fun stuff. I don't really think we want to go there. But I think it's really hard. It would be really hard to have that discussion today with the way with how we have the information.
I'm just concerned, and it was brought up earlier, that we're starting to overlap in the budget process with other committees.
Clearly.
Who are, you know,
What I think we clearly know is that if these policies are adopted, we will not need an override this year. I think that's pretty.
Yeah, but, so we need some more information before we know that for a fact, though, right?
We need to know if the policies are going to be followed.
Right.
Assuming these policies are implemented and followed, it would be not all of them, not the 4%, but the budgeting, the operational. It would be unlikely that we would need an operational override in year one.
In fiscal 21.
Right. Now, that changes if Jeff and the school committee decide to come ask us for, you know, a big budget, that right, those are all like any other year, though, that changes that equation. I have, as both a citizen, a school supporter, and a member of this committee, I would be hesitant, given both the change in method, or the potential change in method, and the time, to think that we could get something done, not only in Whitman, right? Even just putting not only in Hanson, but in Whitman as well. However, I do feel, and I don't know what year, it's evident to me that there will, in the next 5 years, there will need to be an override to both take care of capital and operating costs.
And I think it's important to note too, like I said earlier on, that we're not sacrificing this year to avoid an override.
Correct.
Right.
You know, so
Well, that being said, would you vote?
I would motion that, you know, we make the recommendation that this committee does not recommend an override this year.
I have a comment, but we did sacrifice last year. So we're living on that, in that budget that was sacrificed. So I would just have a hard time voting today, only because we haven't seen our expenses as they relate to this money shifting around, and really what, I guess, a proposed Article 2 would look like, right? And how that
Finance
money
Committee.
all falls into, sure.
That's their,
but-
you know, it's not coming to this committee.
No, it's not.
And this
But
committee,
we're-
I don't think needs to meet
but-
anymore.
Well,
I'm sorry,
I think,
I wasn't,
sorry.
excuse me.
you just say you didn't think we
Excuse me,
needed to
John,
meet
I was-
anymore? Well, we'll have to meet sometime to make,
Hold on.
I'm sorry,
John,
I'm sorry, I'm
I'm
sorry.
still trying to finish
I'm sorry,
my thought.
apologize.
What I'm saying is we haven't seen the expenses. We've seen a great revenue presentation. And I don't mean, no, we've seen the revenue and we've seen how it all is laid out. But we're talking about expenditures and how some of that money gets shifted and moved, and what that bottom line would look like versus against the revenue that you're coming up with. So without having a report of that in front of me, I have a hard time saying that I don't recommend an override this year, and that's just based on, again, where school district is at a deficiency based on the sacrifice last year.
well, I think that combined with not knowing how well these recommendations are going to be received by the Board of Selectmen, I mean, that's essentially the wild card here. I mean, we've made recommendations for 3 hours now, and if the Board of Selectmen decide not to implement any of these, then we're in square one again.
Well, I think that's why it's, in a way, it's important to put some weight on this. That at the very end, is it we vote not to approve, not to recommend an override based on,
When we originally were formed, right, the original thought was, could we get our recommendations in place by October for a fall town meeting to recommend, to potentially recommend an override? And I'm just thinking about timing here, right? To potentially recommend an override, to have the appropriate planning and time in place for the next fiscal year. I think it's January 13th. Even if I had the numbers in front of me, which I don't, and there's open questions around method and what that's going to mean for the biggest piece of our budget, I don't feel that you have the appropriate time that would be needed to successfully educate the public about what's in an override. And I'm all for restoring programs to the schools, particularly if we have it within the levy limit this year, and if it's decided that everything we save from the statutory method should then be directed towards a budget that's presented by the school. I'm okay with that. I am. I just don't see, I don't think we have the information yet to formulate a true override campaign. I would have to say that I would not recommend a 21 override, and I would be focused on potentially the preceding year. Now, I don't know if there are any steps that we can take to make sure that we're ready for 2022, because we have talked a lot about over the past few years, we're going to get out ahead of this. We're going to get out ahead of this, and for whatever reason, it's all of a sudden it's January or February, and we're talking about, you know, do we need an override? And I think we always kind of settle on we don't have enough time to do it, or it's not the appropriate time to do it. I do think it's time to put a plan in place, and maybe that is the strategic plan. I don't know what the time frame for that would be, but I do think we can't. We have to make a recommendation that we can't kick that can any further than you know, the end of 2021, 2022 budgeting process. I mean, it's.
I think it's very clear this would be the last year we can get by without an override.
I agree.
I do not think it's even possible next year. Not to maintain the capital program the way it's supposed to be. Like Don said earlier, the respite with school funding is a one-year relief. It kicks in again next year. You're not going to want to see things going backwards.
We're also going to see some changes to the state's funding formula and what could be required to us as a town, which may, I think people need to be aware, which may put us in an override situation just from what the state's requiring us to maintain from a school funding situation. So, you know.
That'll be in the numbers we see in a couple weeks?
Right.
You're not referring to a benefit to us, you're referring to an
I'm referring
expense.
to the state saying, hey, it's
Pony
time
up
for you to
more.
pony up even more, right, with the new funding formulas and
You won't see
everything that's
that
coming up.
in these numbers. You're looking at when they release them at the end of next year.
Next year.
Right, so it would be for 2022's foundation
So there's
budget.
no change in the formula this year?
No.
So to underscore Randy's comment, we know we're looking at an override in the future.
There's no doubt.
Yeah.
Right.
I think you're wrapping everything up this year with what you're doing, holding everybody at 2.5%. I'm just gonna take a wild guess, Scott and Dave, you got budgets coming in 3.5%, 5%, 6% increases from the municipal government,
Yeah.
fiscal
Yeah,
21.
they were coming in a little bit higher than 2.5.
So what we're doing now is we're gonna show the taxpayers, each budget came in at 2.5%. That's what they rolled their budgets to. And this is what, I don't wanna say consequences, but this is how these our departments are operating at that increase. And
The impact of it.
at that point in time, we've crossed all our Ts and dotted all our Is.
Right.
We've cut where we can cut, we've reduced, we've done this and we've done that, and now it's, hey, the rubber meets the road. We can't do X, we can't do that, the schools can't do this, it's time for an override.
And what I don't want to do is get so far, in, like Chris said, we're getting into this process where you don't have time to do it. Here's what we already know. We really don't know whether, because of the complexity with the school issue and the assessment issue, we don't know a number where that's falling, how that ultimately affects Whitman for another month and a half, maybe sooner, but let's say a month. And then by the time the school committee meets, they figure, then we have the DPW project. That is going to be an override / you don't know where that's going to be. There's several other factors that if you're going to do this once and you're going to ask the taxpayers one more time, you better have it all in place. We're close, we're not there yet. If we could get a strategic plan, fund that, right away, that starts in May, you're probably looking, I would even, at the selectmen level, I think we need to talk about possibly having a fall town meeting anyway.
Right.
That's going to be the time then.
And not knowing, right, there is a change coming to the foundation budget calculations within the schools. Not knowing exactly how that's going to affect us, it could be significant. If that wasn't there, then maybe there's a little bit more appetite to try to kind of rush this through. But knowing that then we could pass something and then all of a sudden that budget becomes, it's not sustainable, given the change in the way the state's calculating things, that's a big concern. And I think to your point, you get one chance to get this right. And if we can move forward in 2021, and I think not just hold the line or not go backwards, but at least hold the line or move forward a little bit. And I think hopefully there are some things there that we can move forward on, particularly with the budget that's presented from the school committee. Then 2022 is the way that in my mind, is what we really need to be kind of setting our sights on.
Right.
And the report for the strategic plan would be the last report we need. We've gotten a lot over the last 2 years, right?
You have every piece at that
Yeah.
point.
Right.
I mean,
You
there
need to start
really,
that campaign in September.
Yeah,
Well, we need to
4th of July.
find the money to pay this for the strategic plan.
well, I think we have, isn't that a definition of free cash?
Got some free cash lying around?
Haven't we beat that to death?
So then I'd like to go forward and make a motion
That we hire a planner.
that this committee vote to not recommend a operational override for fiscal year 2021.
Second.
All in favor? Opposed? 1.
Randy, I assume you'll communicate though that there's a feeling that within a short window,
Well,
we are going to need to be prepared.
what I need,
something. And the strategic plan is part of that.
right, and what I should have, I guess, put a caveat on you, a lot of what we just voted there hinges on what was previously discussed. So when I am glad to have something to bring to the Board of Selectmen and the FinCom on the 21st, but I think this is a package deal. I think that's clear that these recommendations led you to that last vote we just took. If there are major changes, that changes drastically.
Right. Agreed.
Agree?
All right? Frank, did you get all that? I hope so.
See you on the 21st.
Let it be known that Randy Lemontina had a 3-hour meeting
To adjourn?
Without food?
without food.
I'm sorry. All right, motion.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Go LSU!
Did we miss it? No. Just
We
that.
gotta go, yeah, we gotta go quick.